Imagine you wake up one morning and everything looks right. Your coffee cup is where you left it. The cracks in your ceiling follow the same familiar map. Your name is still your name, but something you cannot name and cannot prove feels different. Not wrong exactly, just shifted, as if the world has been rotated by a single degree and then rotated back before anyone could notice. Now imagine that feeling belongs to dozens of people, then hundreds, then millions. Now imagine it is not a feeling at all. This is the story of a small desert county where people began disappearing. Not for long, not permanently. They came back. They always came back. And that, as it turns out, was the most disturbing part of all. Pause 3 seconds, a faint hum rises beneath the silence, because some of them came back wrong. Chapter 1. The Quiet Disappearances. Setting the stage, Coronado Flats County, Nevada. Sound design, distant highway, a dispatch radio, the hiss of fluorescent lights. Coronado Flats County sits in the northeastern corner of Nevada, where the land forgets to be anything particular. The mountains are low and brown and tired. The highway that bisects the county runs straight and indifferent for 67 miles without a single curve, as if the engineers had simply given up on geometry. There are fewer than 4,000 permanent residents. The nearest hospital is 91 miles away. The nearest city, if you are generous with the term, is 114 miles to the southwest. It is, by any reasonable standard, the kind of place that does not make news, until it did. Mara Ellery had worked the night dispatch desk at the Coronado Flats County Sheriff's Office for 11 years. She was 38 years old, methodical, quiet in the specific way of people who have spent years listening to emergencies without becoming immune to them. She drank black coffee from a thermos she had carried since her first day on the job. She kept a handwritten log of every call in addition to the digital record, because she did not fully trust computers with things that mattered. She'd grown up in the county, left for college, and come back after her mother's illness. She had stayed because leaving again had simply never become urgent enough. In the spring of a year that started unremarkably, the calls began. The first one came on a Tuesday in late March. A hiker named Dennis Farrow, 32 years old, from Sacramento, had gone out on the Alkali Ridge Trail at 6 in the morning. His girlfriend, waiting at the trailhead, called the non-emergency line at 4 in the afternoon when he had not returned. Standard protocol. Mara logged it and dispatched a deputy. They found Dennis Farrow sitting on a rock approximately 2 miles from the trailhead at 7:15 that evening. He appeared uninjured. He was calm. He could not account for the missing hours. He thought he'd been walking for perhaps 45 minutes. The deputy filed it under voluntary absence, resolved. Dennis Farrow drove back to Sacramento. End of story. Except it was not the end of the story. 2 weeks later, a woman named Patricia Ossie, 51, a geology teacher from Reno, went missing on the Southern Ridge Trail for 22 hours. She returned on foot to the parking area near the ranger station, calm and unharmed, with no memory of where she'd been. She thought she'd sat down to eat her lunch and then stood up and walked back. Medical staff at the ranger station checked her vitals. Everything was normal. She was dehydrated, but not severely. She had no abrasions, no bruising, no signs of exposure consistent with 22 hours in the desert. A month after that, a 17-year-old boy named Caleb Stern vanished from his family's campsite during the night. He was found standing in the middle of the state highway at dawn, facing east, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. He did not respond to the deputy's vehicle for several seconds. When he did, he blinked slowly and said he did not know how he had gotten there. His parents described his behaviour in the following days as quiet in a new way. They could not elaborate further. Mara noted each of these in her handwritten log. She did not yet connect them. There was nothing obvious to connect. Missing hikers, wandering campers, confused travellers. These were not unusual in a county built on empty land and in different terrain. People got lost. People had medical episodes. People drank too much and wandered. But over the following 3 months, the count climbed. 7 disappearances in April, 11 in May, 14 in June. Each one resolved within 72 hours. Each person returned physically unharmed. Each person could not account for their time away with any coherence. And each person, when pressed for details by deputies or park rangers, described a sensation they all struggled to articulate, a feeling of having been somewhere that was difficult to describe, not because it was frightening, but because it was not quite there in the normal sense of the word there. The sheriff's office classified all incidents as survival events or mental episodes. The county had no psychiatric facility. The state office was not notified. The local newspaper, a weekly that primarily covered school sports and livestock auctions, ran a single paragraph about increased incidents on county trails and recommended hikers carry extra water. Mara Ellery kept her handwritten log. She was the only one counting. 2 are up to 2. The pattern nobody notices, an invisible architecture of coincidence, sound design, the soft scratch of pen on paper, the hum of a computer fan, distant night insects. There is a particular kind of intelligence that flourishes in isolation, not brilliance exactly, but a quality of sustained attention that most people abandon once the immediate novelty of a problem fades. Mara Ellery had this quality. She did not know she had it. She would not have described herself as analytical. She would have said she simply liked things to make sense. By the end of June, she'd begun to notice that things were not making sense in a very specific way. It started with the phones. 3 separate callers reporting missing persons in May had mentioned almost in passing that their cell service had cut out completely before the disappearance. Not weak signal, complete cessation. One caller, a woman whose husband had gone missing near the old mining road, noted that her phone had shown full bars for the entire hike, up until the moment it went dark. It had come back 2 hours later, after her husband had been located. She mentioned it the way people mention strange weather, as a curious detail that seems unrelated to the main event. Mara wrote it in her log. She went back through the previous calls and discovered that in 19 of the 32 incidents she had logged, at least one witness had mentioned a temporary loss of cell signal. Not all of them had noted it prominently. Some had only mentioned it when she'd called back to follow up, as she sometimes did to ensure the department's records were complete. But when she asked directly, the memory was usually there. She began adding a new column to her log. Phone signal disruption. Yes or no. Then she noticed the animals. 6 witnesses, across 6 separate incidents, had mentioned that the birds stopped. Not that the birds flew away or scattered, that they stopped. Bird song one moment, and then a silence so complete that at least 2 witnesses had mentioned feeling their ears ring in the sudden quiet. Dogs had refused to move forward on trails where their owners intended to continue. A camp dog belonging to a family near the southern ridge had reportedly crawled under a vehicle and remained there, shaking, for 40 minutes before emerging, apparently normal. New column. Animal behavioural anomaly. Yes or no? The light reports were harder to quantify. Not all witnesses had seen anything at all, but among those who had, the description was remarkably consistent across incidents that the witnesses had no reason to have compared. A brief flash of white light, not a camera flash, not lightning. The sky had been clear on every occasion, not a reflection of glass or metal. Something that appeared to originate without a source, lasted for less than a second, and cast no shadow. Several witnesses described it as being behind the light, rather than in front of it, as if the light had originated around them, rather than arriving from a direction. Third column, the atmospheric data took her longer to find because she did not initially know she was looking for it. She'd been reading a weather summary from the State Meteorological Service, something she occasionally did out of general interest, when she noticed a notation about a localized distortion event near the Alkali Ridge area in late March. The notation described it as a transient atmospheric pressure anomaly lasting approximately 11 minutes. It was flagged as unexplained but not uncommon in desert terrain, where heat differentials could produce unusual localized effects. She checked the date. It matched the Dennis Farrow incident to within 30 minutes. She requested access to the state meteorological database through the county office, citing general public safety research. It took 2 weeks and a phone call to a sympathetic data analyst named Torrance, who worked out of the Reno office and had a habit of helping people he found interesting. With his unofficial assistance, Mara pulled atmospheric records for Coronado Flats County going back 18 months. The pattern was almost perfect. 28 of the 32 incidents in her log corresponded to a recorded atmospheric distortion event. All of the distortion events had lasted between 9 and 13 minutes, with the majority lasting exactly 11. All of them were localized to an area of less than 2 square miles. None of them had been flagged for follow-up by the Meteorological Service, because individually they appeared entirely unremarkable. Together, they described something that had no name. Mara stared at her log for a long time that night. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The radio crackled with a routine traffic stop 40 miles south. Somewhere outside, a coyote called once and then went quiet. She opened a new page in her notebook and wrote a single question at the top. What happens in 11 minutes? She did not yet have an answer, but she was no longer the only one looking. Chapter 3. The first wrong detail when memory and reality disagree. Sound design, a diner, distant conversation, coffee cups, the creak of a booth. His name was Gary Soltis, and he had been hiking in Coronado Flats County because his therapist had suggested he spend more time outdoors. He was 44 years old, a software project manager from Portland, recently divorced, recently diagnosed with what his doctor described as moderate anxiety. He was, by most measurable standards, a completely ordinary man navigating completely ordinary difficulties. He had been missing for 31 hours. When he turned up at a gas station 12 miles from the trailhead, walking along the highway shoulder with his hiking pack still on, he appeared calm, slightly confused about the time, but calm. He accepted water and sat down on a plastic chair outside the gas station office. He answered the deputy's questions in a measured, cooperative tone. He was not distressed. He was not injured. His GPS device had recorded nothing after the 6th hour of his hike, and then resumed recording as if nothing had happened. 2 days later, he called the sheriff's office from Portland. He wanted to report a discrepancy, he said. He did not know if it was worth reporting, but it was bothering him, and he thought someone should know. The deputy who answered transferred him to Mara because she had made the follow-up calls, and he had spoken with her before. There is a café on the corner of Hawthorne and 23rd in Portland, Gary told her. I have been going there for 9 years. It is called the Blue Anchor. The walls have always been blue, kind of a deep navy. You know, it is in the name. When I got home and walked by it yesterday, the walls were red. Dark red. Like they have always been red. And I asked the woman at the counter about it, and she looked at me like I had two heads. She said they have never painted the place since she started working there 6 years ago. She showed me old photographs. The walls are red in the photographs, but I remember them blue. I remember them blue very clearly. Mara wrote it down. She thanked him and told him she would note it in the file. She looked at her log. Then she began calling the other returned individuals. Not all of them were reachable. Some had not left contact information, but of the 19 she was able to reach, 14 reported some version of the same phenomenon. A detail from their ordinary life that they remembered one way and found another. A woman from Boise who had been missing for 18 hours came home to find that a tree in her front yard, a large cottonwood she had planted with her late father, was not there. A neighbour confirmed the tree had never been there. The woman had photographs of herself standing beside it at her daughter's birthday party 3 years prior. She could not find the photographs. A man from Phoenix who had disappeared for 44 hours remembered a road that ran between his neighbourhood and the grocery store, a route he drove twice a week. The road did not exist. When he drove to where it should have been, there was a chain link fence and a construction lot that neighbours said had been there for years. A retired school teacher from Las Vegas described coming home to find that her cat was not the same cat. Not a different cat. The same cat, same name, same markings, but wrong somehow in a way she could not articulate to her daughter. The cat responded to its name and showed recognition of familiar people and places, but the teacher said it was wrong, and she would not elaborate further except to say that she knew what her cat felt like when it sat in her lap, and this was not that. Doctors, when these reports were shared with them, classified the anomalies as trauma-induced confabulation. The brain, they explained, sometimes generates false memories in response to acute stress or disorientation. The missing time itself was stressful enough to produce exactly this kind of retroactive misremembering. The phenomenon was well documented. The affected individuals were advised to rest and, in several cases, referred for counselling. The doctors were not wrong. Confabulation was real and documented. The explanation was logical. But Mara noted something in her log that the doctors had not been given the opportunity to consider. The wrong details were not random. They were not the kind of random substitutions that confabulation typically produced. Vague, shapeless misrecollections of faces or names. They were specific, architectural. They described physical features of the world, colours, structures, roads, trees, animals, features that were verifiable, features that did not match. She wrote a note to herself in the margin of her log. Not confusion, discrepancy. There is a difference. Chapter 4. The Replacement Theory. A neurologist steps into the dark. Sound design, hospital corridor ambience, the hum of medical equipment, soft footsteps. Dr. Lionel Cade had spent 23 years studying the human brain and had arrived at the comfortable professional position of a man who believes he has learned the shape of his ignorance. He knew what the brain could do and what it could not. He knew how it failed and how it recovered, and the thousands specific ways it told stories about reality that were not entirely true. He was not a man given to dramatic conclusions. He had first heard about the Coronado Flats cases from a colleague at the University of Nevada, a cognitive psychologist named Dr. Adaeze Nwosu, who had been conducting informal interviews with several of the returned individuals. Dr. Nwosu had called him not because she was alarmed, but because she was puzzled and preferred to be puzzled with company. The confabulation hypothesis does not hold, she had told him. These people are not filling gaps. They are describing specific, externally verifiable details that turn out to be wrong. Confabulation is internal. You generate a plausible sounding memory to fill a hole. What these people are doing is something different. They are generating memory that is specific, vivid, consistent over time, and objectively incorrect about the external world. Cade had said he was skeptical. She had sent him the brain scans. He looked at them for a long time, then he called her back. The scans were from 4 of the returned individuals who had agreed to neurological testing. All 4 showed the same pattern, subtle enough that it would not have been remarkable to anyone who was not looking for it specifically. The neural pathway formations associated with episodic memory, the structural traces that the brain lays down when it experiences and encodes real events, showed activity consistent with extended, complex lived experience during the period of missing time. This was, on its face, unremarkable. The brain continued to process and encode during various states of altered consciousness. The puzzle was not the activity itself. The puzzle was the content. Standard episodic encoding produced patterns that, when analysed, correlated with the individual's existing memory architecture. Familiar faces, known environments, recognisable emotional contexts. What the scans from the returned individuals showed was encoding that was entirely novel. Not random, not chaotic, structured, sequential, coherent, but built from experiential raw material that bore no relationship to anything in the individual's existing memory. They had lived something. The brain said so clearly and without ambiguity. They had lived something that had never happened to them. Cade flew to Nevada. He met Dr. Nwosu. Together, they requested access to additional subjects through the sheriff's office. Mara Ellery, who had been watching the investigation expand in slow motion around her, agreed to facilitate the introductions. She met Cade at the county's single coffee shop on a Thursday morning in August. He was thin and careful in his movements and spoke with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned to mean exactly what he said. He sat across from her and looked at her log. He read it twice without speaking. Then he closed it and set it on the table between them. "I am going to propose something to you," he said, "and I want you to understand that I am a neurologist and I do not say things like this professionally. I am saying it to you here, in this context, because I think you have earned the right to hear what I actually think, rather than what I am willing to put in writing." She told him to go ahead. "The people who went missing from this county," he said, "were not harmed. They were not injured. They experienced no trauma that I can measure. Their neurological profiles are healthy across all standard metrics, but they were somewhere else. The brain data is unambiguous about that. They had continuous, coherent experience during their absence, and when they came back, a subset of them returned with misaligned external memories. Memories of a world that does not quite match the one they left." He paused. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "My hypothesis is that these individuals were temporarily displaced from this version of themselves. Not abducted in the traditional sense, not experimented upon, something else, something that might be most accurately described as..." He stopped, started again. What if they were not taken? What if they were temporarily replaced? And what if the replacement was not precise? What if the return process, whatever it is, occasionally delivers a person back to a reality that is not quite the one they departed from? The coffee shop was quiet. A truck moved past outside. Mara looked at him steadily. Replaced by what? She asked. Cade set down his cup. That, he said, is the part I cannot explain. Chapter 5. The recording evidence that should not exist. Sound design, static crackle, the hiss of analog recording, wind over open ground. Park Ranger Elena Vasquez had been working the southern district of Coronado Flats County State Park for 4 years when she went missing on a Tuesday afternoon in September. She was 29 years old, experienced, fit, and carried standard issue equipment, including a GPS unit, a satellite communicator, and a body cam she wore clipped to her shirt front because the state park system had recently mandated their use after a liability incident in another county. She was missing for 63 hours. When she returned, found walking calmly on the access road near the eastern gate, she appeared unharmed, hydrated, and oriented. She knew her name and date of birth. She correctly identified the deputies who met her. She did not know where she had been or what she had done for 63 hours. The satellite communicator had transmitted a healthy signal for the first 2 hours of her patrol and then gone dark. It had resumed transmitting from her location on the access road approximately 40 minutes before she was found. Her body cam battery had discharged, expected after 3 days, but the memory card was intact. The footage was reviewed by the county sheriff as a routine procedural step. The first hour and 40 minutes showed standard patrol activity, terrain checks, trail markers, a brief wildlife observation note, a radio check-in. Then it showed something else. The air changed. It is difficult to describe in precise technical language. The footage did not show anything that a camera was clearly not designed to capture. But the air in the frame began to move in a way that air does not move. Not wind. The grass in the background was still. The distortion was localized, a bending and shimmering of the space ahead of Elena Vasquez as she walked that resembled extreme heat distortion, but was not consistent with the temperature or the terrain. The distortion occupied approximately a 12-foot wide area, roughly 40 feet in front of her. Then the sky changed. For a period of approximately 4 seconds, in footage recorded at 2:17 in the afternoon, under a clear blue desert sky, stars were visible. Not one or two, a dense field of stars, clearly visible in the upper portion of the frame above the distorted air. They appeared without transition and disappeared without transition, as if someone had briefly switched the sky. Elena Vasquez did not stop walking. She walked toward the distortion steadily, without hesitation, without breaking stride. The camera recorded her walking into the area of distorted air. For 9 frames, less than a third of a second at standard playback, the footage showed nothing but white. Then it showed empty desert. She was gone. The camera continued recording for 6 minutes, pointing at empty ground where she'd been standing. Then it continued recording through the remainder of her absence, showing only the static landscape and the slow movement of shadows as time passed. No further anomalies were captured. An audio analyst working for a private firm, contracted by Dr. Cade, who had now obtained unofficial research access to county incident materials through Mara's cooperation, submitted a report on the audio track from the 60 seconds before Eleanor walked into the distortion. The ambient sound was initially unremarkable. Wind, her footsteps, the creak of her equipment. Then at minus 47 seconds, a layer of sound appeared beneath the ambient track. Not over it, beneath it, as if originating from a slightly different acoustic space. The audio analyst described it as multiple voices speaking simultaneously in overlapping registers, with no consistent dominant frequency suggesting a single sound source. The voices were not decipherable at standard playback. Slowed to 10% speed, they separated into approximately 4 distinct tonal registers, none of which matched human speech patterns in their prosodic structure. The rhythm was there, a communicative cadence, a pattern of pause and continuation, but the phonetic content, if it could be called that, did not correspond to any known language. There was one exception. At -12 seconds, one of the layers briefly aligned with the others and produced, for approximately 0.8 of a second, something that the audio analyst described as a composite vocalization that my software flags as containing elements of English phonology, though this may be artifact or pareidolia. He included a waveform and a spectrogram. He did not speculate further. Mara listened to the slowed audio 47 times. On the 47th listen, sitting alone in her office at 2 a.m, she heard it. A voice, or something shaped like a voice, that sounded, if she was being completely honest with herself, like her name. Chapter 6. The Second Return. What the child remembered. Sound design, the creak of a screen door, a child's voice at a distance, summer evening insects. Her name was Lily Strausser, and she was 9 years old, and she had first gone missing in April on a family camping trip for 28 hours. She had come back fine. That was the word her parents used when asked. Fine. Her mother, Sandra Strausser, had added to that word when speaking to the deputy. She came back fine but quiet, quieter than usual. She slept for 14 hours and then she was fine. Lily was the youngest person in Mara's log. On the second Sunday of October, Lily went missing again. Her family had returned to the county, not because they had intended to camp again, but because Sandra Strausser's mother lived in Coronado Flats, and Lily had insisted on coming along for the visit. She had, according to her grandmother, been asking to come back to the county specifically since the spring. The grandmother had thought this was sweet. The child had clearly loved the camping trip, despite everything. Lily disappeared from the grandmother's backyard at 4 p.m. She was found walking on the highway access road at 11 the next morning. 19 hours. She was calm and uninjured. She accepted water and a blanket from the deputy and sat down in the back of the patrol vehicle without protest. Mara drove out to meet them. She sat beside Lily in the back of the patrol vehicle while Sandra Strausser called her husband from outside. The day was warm and pale and still. Lily looked out the window at the landscape with an expression that Mara could not quite categorize. Not fear, not confusion. Something that looked in a child's face like a very specific kind of sadness that did not belong there. "Do you want to tell me what you remember?" Mara asked. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They are fixing mistakes." Mara did not react visibly. She had learned in 11 years of dispatch to keep her face neutral when people said things that should not be said. "Who is fixing mistakes?" she asked. Lily looked at her. "I do not know what to call them. They do not look like you would think. They are not really there in the way things are usually there." "What do you mean?" "Like if you look at them directly, they are not fully there. But if you look next to them, you can see more of them." "Like stars," Lily said. "You know how, if you look at a faint star directly, it disappears? Like that." Mara knew exactly like what. She had been an amateur stargazer since childhood. The averted vision technique, looking slightly away from a faint star to use the more light-sensitive rods at the edges of the retina rather than the cones at the centre. It was a real phenomenon. The child had described it precisely. "What did they want?" Mara asked. Lily thought about this. They were not talking to me the way you are. It was more like they were looking at me, comparing. Like when you put two photographs next to each other to see if they match. She paused. I was in a room. It was very large, but there were no walls. Not like an open room. The walls just were not there in the way I expected them to be. Like they existed somewhere I could not look. She frowned, working through the language of an adult experience with a child's vocabulary. There were a lot of people there, not just me. Different people, at different times. Not all at the same time. Were you afraid? Lily considered this seriously. No, they were not mean. They were just careful. Very careful. Like if you were handling something you did not want to break. Did they say anything to you? Anything you could understand? The child looked back out the window. A long pause. One of them told me that there are other versions. Of everything. Of all of us. And they're trying to understand which ones are real. I think they made a mistake with some people. Mixed them up. She turned back. Her eyes were very dark and very serious. They're trying to fix it. Mara drove home that night and sat in her kitchen for 3 hours without turning the lights on. Chapter 7. The Hidden Event. A map of silence stretching across decades. Sound design. The hum of a server room. The click of keyboard keys. A very distant aircraft. The FAA report was not classified in any dramatic sense. It was not stamped with red warnings or locked in a vault. It lived in a database accessible to licensed aviation professionals and researchers under a standard public records framework, buried under the kind of bureaucratic nomenclature that ensured almost no one would ever look for it. The relevant report was titled Transient Spatial Interference Events, a collation of anomalous air traffic control data, 1972 through present. It had been compiled by an FAA data analyst named Gerald Hook, who had retired in 2008, and who had never, to anyone's knowledge, given an interview or spoken publicly about its contents. Mara found it through a chain of document references that began with an academic paper on GPS signal anomalies, and ended 3 searches later with a download link that took 47 minutes to fully render on the county office's internet connection. It was 231 pages long. She read all of it. The core of the report was a database of what Hook called TSIS, Transient Spatial Interference Events. These were defined as localized atmospheric anomalies that produced brief, unexplained disruptions to radar, radio, and GPS systems in a defined area, lasting between 8 and 14 minutes, leaving no measurable residue and occurring without correlation to any standard meteorological or geophysical phenomenon. Hook had been collecting these reports since 1972, initially as a curiosity, and eventually as what the report's preface described, with academic restraint, as a potentially significant data set. There were 4,712 events in the database. They spanned every continent except Antarctica. They clustered in no particular geographic pattern. There were concentrations in the American Southwest, in the Eastern European plains, in the Australian outback, and in several sub-Saharan regions, but they also appeared in dense urban environments, in coastal areas, in mountainous terrain, and in the open ocean, as reported by ship radar systems. Their only consistent feature, beyond the duration, was their apparent preference for low population density areas. They occurred in cities, but less frequently, as if whatever produced them preferred quiet. Hook had attempted several correlations with known phenomena. He had checked solar activity, geomagnetic fluctuations, military exercise schedules, atmospheric testing, industrial electromagnetic output. None of the correlations were significant. He had also, and this was the page that made Mara put down her coffee and sit very still, attempted a correlation with publicly reported incidents of unexplained déjà vu. This had required him to use a proxy dataset, since déjà vu was not systematically reported, but he had used newspaper archives, medical case reports, and, in the later portion of the study period, online forum data. His methodology was imperfect, and he acknowledged this clearly. But the correlation was there. In the regions and time periods where TSIE density was highest, reports of unexplained déjà vu described as unusually intense, unusually specific, and associated with events or memories that did not correspond to the experience as actual life, spiked measurably in the weeks and months following the events. The spike was not enormous. It was not the kind of thing that would make headlines, but it was consistent. Statistically, it was not noise. Hook's conclusion, written in the dry institutional language of a federal data analyst who had learned to hide behind precision, was that the observed correlations suggest the possibility of a low-intensity environmental phenomenon of unknown origin producing cognitive effects in the human population within the affected area, the nature of which warrants further study. The report had been filed, logged, and forgotten. Mara sent a copy to Cade that night. He called her at 6 the following morning. "I have been looking at this all night," he said. "So have I," she said. "The events in this database," he said, "they match my scan data, not the geographic events, the neurological signature, the type of experiential encoding I am finding in the returned individuals, the pattern of intrusive experience that does not belong to the individual's own history. It is the same pattern. Mara, it is the same pattern everywhere." She was quiet for a moment. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. "Since at least 1972, he said, but Hook notes that the earliest data in his collection is limited by the availability of radar and radio systems to detect the anomalies. The events themselves may predate the data by," he paused, "by any length of time." Chapter 8. The Realization. What the evidence has been building towards sound design. A long, slow, deepening drone. A single tone held beneath everything. There is a moment in any investigation, whether conducted by detectives, scientists, or solitary women in desert county dispatch offices, when the data stops being a collection of individual puzzles and becomes a single shape. The moment when you can no longer pretend that you're dealing with unrelated anomalies. The moment when the thing you have been circling finally has a centre. Cade reached that moment on a Thursday evening in November. He was sitting in his hotel room in the county seat. He had been staying for 2 weeks now, working with Dr. Nwosu on expanded scans, with 4 laptops open and printouts covering the bed, the floor, and both chairs. He had been working for 19 hours. He was not tired in the conventional sense. He was the specific kind of awake that comes when the brain is running ahead of itself towards something it has already understood and is waiting for the rest of the mind to catch up. He called Mara. He asked her to come. She arrived 20 minutes later and found him standing in the centre of his paper-covered room, staring at a whiteboard he had propped against the television. On the whiteboard were 3 columns. He had been writing and erasing for hours. The current version was the clearest it had been. He said, "I need to tell you what I think is happening, and I need you to understand that I am not prone to speculative thinking, and that what I am about to say is the most conservative explanation I have been able to construct that fits all of the data, every piece of it. The atmospheric anomalies, the brain scans, the memory discrepancies, the FAA database, the child's testimony, the body cam footage. every piece. Mara sat down on the edge of the bed, moving a stack of printouts aside. "Go ahead," she said. Cade turned to face her. "They are not abducting people randomly," he said. "There is no evidence of harm, no evidence of medical experimentation, no evidence of the classic patterns associated with alien abduction as culturally understood. The people who are taken do not come back traumatized in the way that trauma research would predict for a genuinely threatening experience. They come back calm, confused, yes, but calm. The child was not afraid. Elena Vasquez walked into it without hesitation. The brain data shows no stress response encoding during the period of absence. Whatever they experienced, fear was not a significant component." "So what were they experiencing?" Mara asked. "Being observed," Cade said. "Being compared. Being studied in the way that a researcher studies a sample, carefully, precisely, with an interest in accuracy rather than an interest in harm." He paused. Lily Strausser said it perfectly. She said they were comparing her to other versions. She said they were checking which ones were real. And I think that is literally what is happening. He sat down. The brain data shows encoding of entirely foreign experience that did not happen to the individual in this world. The memory discrepancies show people returning with detailed, specific, verifiable but wrong memories of physical reality. Buildings that are the wrong color, roads that are in the wrong place, trees that do not exist. The FAA data shows these events happening globally for at least 50 years, possibly much longer. And the correlating déjà vu data shows that the people who experience the anomaly region, even without being taken, show elevated rates of intrusive memory that does not belong to them. He looked at her. "Human beings exist," he said, "in at least 2 versions of reality simultaneously. Possibly more. We, our individual selves, exist in parallel configurations across what I am going to call, for lack of any better terminology, adjacent worlds. These configurations are almost identical, but not perfectly, and some intelligence, some agency, some civilization that has mastered the ability to move between these configurations has been sampling us, taking individual humans briefly out of one configuration and comparing them against their counterparts in adjacent configurations, looking at the differences, studying the divergence. The room was very quiet. "The people who come back wrong," Mara said slowly. "They are not wrong, are they?" Cade looked at her. "No," he said. "They are not wrong. They are right. They are exactly right. For a slightly different version of this world. They were returned to the wrong configuration, accidentally. Or," he stopped. "Or what? Or as part of a process we do not understand well enough to evaluate." Chapter 9. Mara disappears. The recorder stays behind. Sound design, silence. Then the faintest possible drone, barely perceptible, rising over 4 minutes. The call came in at 2:47 in the morning on a Friday in late November. A long-haul trucker on the state highway reported a light disturbance near milepost 61. "Like the air got bent," he said, and then it was fine. He reported it because he had recently heard something on a podcast about the county, and he thought someone should know. He was apologetic about calling. Mara was at her desk. She logged the call and dispatched a deputy, and then after a moment of sitting entirely still, she did something she had not done before. In 11 years at the desk, she left. She drove to milepost 61. She brought her handwritten log and her personal voice recorder a small digital device she used for taking notes, and she parked on the highway shoulder and got out of her car and stood in the cold desert air and looked at the darkness. Nothing was visible. The highway was empty. The stars were enormous and indifferent in the way that desert stars always are, each one impossibly far away, and at the same time the only companion for miles. The temperature was 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Her breath made small white clouds. She pressed record on the voice recorder and said the date and time and her name. Standard practice from a decade of documentation. Then she put the recorder in her jacket pocket and waited. 14 minutes later, the deputy arrived at milepost 61 and found Mara's car parked on the shoulder with the driver's door open. Her log was on the seat. Her keys were in the ignition. There was no sign of distress, no sign of struggle, no sign of anything. Just an open door and an empty car on a cold highway at 3 a.m. Her voice recorder was not in the car. It was found by Cade 49 hours later, sitting on the hood of Mara's car, which had been moved to the county impound lot. No one could explain how it had gotten there. The lot was fenced and secured. The recorder showed no signs of having been exposed to the elements for 2 days, despite the fact that it had been outside in November desert conditions if it had been with Mara the whole time. The recording was intact. Cade listened to it alone the first time. Then he called Dr. Nwosu. They listened together. The first 40 seconds were ambient sound. Highway, wind, Mara's breathing. Then a sound that was familiar. The atmospheric quality that had appeared in the body cam audio before Elena Vasquez's disappearance. Not identical, but recognizable. A layering of registers that occupied a frequency slightly below normal ambient. A communal sound that was not quite a voice and not quite anything else. Mara could be heard walking, calmly, unhurried footsteps on gravel. Then silence for approximately 12 minutes. The recorder continued running, picking up ambient sound, a distant truck, the night wind. The 12 minutes of normal air. Then the layered sound began again. And then Mara's voice, clearly and without distress, saying, "Where am I?" The response was not in human sound. It was in the layered register of the other voices, but overlaid on that register, woven through it like a translation, delivered simultaneously, in a cadence that was not quite speech but contained something that Cade later described as the functional syntax of communication was a phrase. He transcribed it. Correction phase incomplete. Then the recording ended. Chapter 10. The Returned Dispatcher. The world that has been waiting. Sound design, a car door closing, the sound of a familiar street, the small disorientation of home. Mara returned 49 hours after she disappeared. She was found by a county road crew at 7 a.m, standing in the parking lot of the sheriff's office, waiting by the back door as if she'd arrived for a shift change. She was wearing the same clothes. She was not cold despite the temperature and the 2 days that had passed. She had a coffee cup in her hand, a paper cup from the county seat diner, 12 miles away, purchased at a time that the diner's register showed as 5:52 that morning, which meant she had somehow travelled 12 miles and returned to the sheriff's office parking lot in under 40 minutes with no vehicle. She appeared in every observable way entirely normal. She said she was fine. The exact same word Sandra Strausser had used about Lily. Fine. She passed the medical evaluation. Her vitals were normal. Her cognition tested normally. She identified her colleagues, her supervisor, current events, her address, her date of birth, everything correctly. The sheriff, deeply relieved, told her to take 2 weeks off. She nodded and drove home. She sat in her kitchen for an hour before she turned on the lights. Then she began to notice it started small. The kitchen faucet was on the right. She had a clear, strong memory of it being on the left, not a vague sense of wrongness, a specific memory. She had replaced the faucet herself 4 years ago after the old one began dripping, and she had chosen the right-hand model, specifically because the plumbing feed came from the right. She remembered the plumber's advice. She remembered paying the invoice. She looked at the faucet for a long time. It was on the right. It had always been on the right. The plumbing feed came from the right. She was not confused. She had the memory of placing it on the left. And the faucet was on the right. She called Cade. "Tell me something specific," she said. "Tell me something that we discussed in this county that I would remember." Cade was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about their first meeting at the coffee shop. He told her what she'd been wearing. He told her the specific phrase she had used when he proposed the replacement theory, the question she had asked him. He told her about the afternoon she had read the Hook report and the fact that she had sent it to him at 11:17 at night. Every detail was correct, every single detail. "I remember all of that," Mara said. Then, "But my kitchen faucet is in the wrong place," she said. "And my neighbour across the street. The house has a green door. I remember it being brown. I remember thinking it was a nice brown, a warm colour when I moved in. But it is green, and she told me it has always been green. And my supervisor, he mentioned this morning that we talked about my vacation request last month. I have no memory of making a vacation request last month. He described a 30-minute conversation in detail. I cannot account for a single word of it." Cade was quiet for a long time. "How many?" he finally asked. Mara had been keeping a list on the notepad by her kitchen counter. She'd been writing things down as she noticed them, in the methodical way she had always done things. 17 so far, she said, and I have only been home for 2 hours. There was silence on the line. "Cade," she said. "Yes. The correction phase is incomplete," she said. "That is what they told me. I am not back in the right place, am I? I am back somewhere very close to where I left from. But it is not exactly the same. And I need to decide whether to tell anyone else that." Another long silence. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Mara looked at the faucet on the right side of the sink. She looked at the green door across the street. "I want to finish what I started," she said, "and I want to understand what they meant by correction phase incomplete, because I do not think they were talking about my return." She closed her notepad and looked out the window at a world that was very nearly, but not exactly, her own. Chapter 11. Global shift. When the pattern becomes too large to ignore. Sound design, a low global hum, the sound of millions of conversations happening simultaneously. The first forum post appeared on a general interest forum on the 7th of December. The title was deliberately vague. Has anyone else been noticing small differences in your normal environment? The post described a man in Manchester, England, who had come home from a 3-day business trip to find that his living room wall was the wrong shade of yellow. Not dramatically wrong, almost the same colour, the same general hue, just slightly different. His wife confirmed the wall had not been painted. His sister, who had visited the week before, confirmed the colour. He alone remembered it differently. He included a photograph he had taken before the trip. The wall in the photograph was a subtly different shade than the wall in his living room. Within 72 hours, the post had received 4,300 responses. Not all of them were about wall colours. The specifics varied enormously. Textures, dimensions, colours, sounds, the behaviour of familiar animals, the position of furniture, the layout of streets, the names of shops, One woman in São Paulo described coming home to find her houseplants on the wrong sides of the windowsill, perfectly healthy, but wrong. She had arranged them by their light requirements over 5 years, and the arrangement had been reversed as if a mirror had been placed between her memory and reality. A teenage boy in Seoul reported that his school building had one fewer window on the 3rd floor than he remembered it having. He provided a photograph from 2 months prior showing the window. The forum thread was the largest anyone on the platform could recall. It was eventually archived and then deleted, with the platform citing storage concerns, but not before it had been screen captured and reposted approximately 1,100 times. Reddit threads proliferated. Conspiracy theory communities found the pattern first and interpreted it through their existing frameworks: Mandela effect, simulation theory, dimensional shift, with the enthusiasm and imprecision of communities that had been waiting for exactly this kind of confirmation for years. But beneath the noise, something more careful was also emerging. Aggregated reports, time-stamped and geolocated, that described the memory discrepancies with unusual specificity and unusual consistency. A data scientist named Priya Subramaniam, working independently and posting her analysis under a pseudonym, mapped the geolocated reports against the FAA anomaly database that had been partially leaked online in a document drop associated with a separate Freedom of Information request. The correlation was not perfect, but it was far beyond statistical noise. People who lived within 50 miles of a documented TSIE event in the preceding 12 months were significantly more likely to report a memory discrepancy than the general population. The discrepancies were not random. They were geographically clustered. They corresponded loosely but measurably to the distribution of events that Hook had been documenting since 1972. The phenomenon had never been absent. It had always been global. It had always been here. They had simply never been looking for it at the right scale simultaneously. Governments began to respond, which is to say that governments began to become aware that they needed to appear to be responding. The United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration issued a brief statement describing the social media reports as a cultural phenomenon driven by confirmation bias and the well-documented unreliability of human memory. The British Meteorological Office published a more measured assessment, noting that isolated reports of environmental perception discrepancy did not constitute evidence of an actual physical anomaly. The European Space Agency said nothing but quietly redirected 2 of its Earth observation satellites toward a slightly different coverage pattern. The internal briefings, which would take years to surface through investigative journalism and freedom of information requests, painted a different picture. At least 3 separate national intelligence services had been tracking the TSIE phenomenon for decades. None of them had shared their data with the others. None of them had reached a definitive conclusion about the source. All of them had concluded independently that the phenomenon was real, was beyond current human understanding, and should not be disclosed. The reason given in all 3 briefings was essentially the same. There was no actionable response, and disclosure without a response would generate panic without benefit. They were not wrong about the logic. They were wrong about the timeline, because the events were accelerating. Chapter 12. Final Revelation. The Visitor's Purpose, Reconsidered. Sound design, silence building. A lone, clean tone, the feeling of arrival. Mara heard the signal again, on the 21st of December. She was at her desk. She had returned to work after her 2 weeks off, because the work mattered, and the desk was where she understood things, when she heard it at the edge of her perception. Not through the radio, not through the phones, through the air somehow. The way you hear a tone that you're not sure you're actually hearing. The kind of frequency that sits at the exact border between sound and sensation. She had heard it before. She had not known the first time what it was. She knew now. She picked up her handwritten log. She set it on the desk in front of her. She looked at the dates, the columns, the carefully noted yes and no, and sometimes, and unclear. 11 months of documentation, 32 initial cases, then 47, then 61, then the number she had stopped counting at, which was well above 100 for Coronado Flats County alone. The atmospheric distortions that lasted exactly 11 minutes, the silence before, the light that had no source, the children who came back quieter, the adults who came back carrying memories of a world that was not quite this one. Cade had called her that morning from a conference in London, where he was presenting a carefully worded paper about novel neurological encoding patterns to a room of colleagues who were not yet ready to hear what he was actually saying. He had told her that his expanded dataset, now including sourced scan data from institutions in Germany, South Korea, Argentina, and Canada, confirmed what the Coronado Flats data had first suggested. The pattern was universal. The neurological signature of exchange was identical across cultures, continents, and decades. Whatever was doing this had been doing it everywhere, to everyone, for as long as anyone had been capable of detecting it. And it is speeding up, he had said. The interval between events in any given region is shortening. The frequency is increasing. The Hook database showed approximately one event per region per year in the 1970s. By 2000, that had increased to 4 per year. Current data suggests we are at somewhere between 12 and 15 per region, annually and climbing. Mara had asked him what he thought that meant. He had been quiet for a moment. I think, he had said, that whatever they're trying to understand, they're getting closer to understanding it. And I think the increasing frequency means that the study is entering a new phase. I do not know what the new phase is, but I think the data suggests they're moving from observation to something else. Sitting at her desk now, listening to the signal at the edge of perception, Mara thought about the things she'd been told, and the things she had noticed, and the things she had held in her hands, and studied until they gave up their shape. The visitors, she had no better word for them than the one the story had given them, were not invaders. Invasion had a grammar. Advance, overwhelm, occupy. None of that applied here. There was no advance guard, no overwhelm, no occupation. 50 years of events and not a single act of harm. Not a single piece of evidence that the intent was anything other than what Lily had described. Comparison. Careful study. The slow and precise work of understanding something complex. They were not conquerors, they were researchers, and humanity was the subject. Not in the way that abduction mythology had always framed it. Not as a resource to be harvested or an experiment to be conducted on unwilling bodies. Something more abstract and in a different way, more profound. They were studying not what humans were made of, but what humans were made into. Not biology, but history. The branching, diverging, endlessly forking history of a species playing out simultaneously across adjacent configurations of the same world. They were reading the differences between versions. They were documenting the 1,000 small ways that human lives diverged from their counterparts in near-identical worlds. They were, in some capacity that Mara could only partially articulate, trying to understand which version of humanity was most itself, which version was most real. The return errors, the people deposited in the slightly wrong world, were not malfunctions in the malicious sense. They were, perhaps, the inevitable imprecision of a process operating at a scale and complexity beyond anything human civilization had yet conceived. Moving individual consciousnesses between adjacent realities was, presumably, difficult. The occasional misplacement was error, not cruelty. And the phrase that had reached her through the recording, "correction phase incomplete," was not a threat. It was a status report, an acknowledgement that the calibration was ongoing, that the work was not finished, that they were still learning. The signal grew slightly louder, not alarming, just present. Mara thought about the other version of herself, the version that had gone into the distortion at milepost 61 and had been held briefly in a space without walls and had been studied with the careful attention that Lily described. She thought about what that other Mara had seen and known and experienced in 49 hours. She thought about whether other Mara was alive and well in some adjacent configuration of this world, sitting at a desk that was almost identical to this one, in a building that was almost identical to this one, with a faucet that was definitely on the left side of her kitchen sink. She hoped so. The signal peaked and held for exactly 11 minutes, then it faded, somewhere in the county, in the desert, in a place that was 2 square miles of unremarkable terrain under an enormous sky. Something happened, and then was over, and left nothing behind but the silence that follows a very large and very quiet event. Mara opened a new page in her log. She wrote the date and time. She wrote, Event 47, duration 11 minutes, no reported missing persons, yet. And then she wrote, underneath it, in smaller letters, something she had not written in the log before. A question, not a record. A wondering, not a report. How many versions of this night are happening right now? And in how many of them does someone sit down and start to write the answer? She capped her pen. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The radio crackled with a routine traffic stop 40 miles south. Outside, the desert was enormous and still and full of whatever it had always been full of, moving quietly through the dark between the stars. Final narration, the question that remains. Sound design, the gentlest possible ambient tone. Desert wind, the sense of infinite space. There is a thought experiment that physicists have debated since the middle of the 20th century. It goes by various names: the many worlds interpretation, the multiverse hypothesis, the branching universe model. The idea is deceptively simple, that every quantum event, every moment at which the universe must choose between 2 or more outcomes, does not choose. Every outcome happens. The universe branches, and every branch continues forward, and somewhere in the infinite dark, beyond the edge of human observation, every version of you that could possibly exist does. It is an idea that has always lived in the domain of mathematics and philosophy, untestable, unverifiable, significant only as a way of understanding equations that otherwise produce uncomfortable infinities. But Mara Ellery sits in Coronado Flats County with a handwritten log that now spans 412 separate events and counting. Dr. Lionel Cade has published 3 papers, each one slightly less cautious than the last, each one receiving slightly more attention from communities that were not, until recently, paying attention. The FAA Anomaly database has been downloaded by more than 9,000 researchers since it was leaked. Priya Subramaniam is now leading a team of 46 volunteer data scientists, mapping the global distribution of reported reality discrepancies against documented TSIE events, and their preliminary results have been shared with two separate national scientific bodies, both of which have responded with requests for additional data rather than dismissal. The signal continues, the events continue, the frequency continues to increase. Somewhere in a space without walls, in an architecture that does not obey the rules of the geometry you learned in school, a consciousness or consciousnesses that has been studying human existence for longer than some of human civilization has been thinking about stars, is still comparing, still measuring, still trying to understand the thousand subtle divergences between the version of you that is here and the version of you that is there. They are not hostile. The evidence suggests this clearly. They are not indifferent. The care and precision of the process suggests this equally clearly. What they are is something that human language has not yet developed a word for, because human language developed in a world that did not yet know it needed one. A word for an intelligence that does not want to conquer or communicate or trade or make contact in any of the ways that science fiction imagined for the entire second half of the 20th century. A word for something that wants, above all else, to understand, and that has the patience to study you for 50 years, 100 years, perhaps longer, before it decides what understanding looks like. Are they choosing? Are they selecting? Are they deciding which version of humanity continues in the way that Mara came to suspect in the last pages of her log? Or are they simply watching the way you might watch a river? Not because you intend to redirect it, but because the river is extraordinary and you are a creature that finds extraordinary things worth the time? The honest answer is, we do not know. We do not know because we have only just begun to ask the question. We do not know because the question is so large and so strange that every framework we have developed for understanding ourselves and our universe requires revision before it can contain the answer. We do not know because knowing, in this case, may require us to become something we are not yet. But the signal runs through the desert air tonight, and somewhere in the dark at milepost 61, something bends the space between the stars and does the quiet, careful work of understanding what it means to be human. All versions of it, every one.
There's a memory I've carried my entire life, crystal clear, undeniable, the kind of memory that feels more real than what happened yesterday. Everyone from my hometown has it too. We all lived through the same event. We all remember it vividly. Except when we talk about it, nothing matches. Not the small details, not the perspectives, the entire structure of what happened. And the strangest part? None of us feel uncertain. We all know exactly what we saw. We just can't agree on what that was. This is the story of the night something happened in my town. Something we all experienced. Something none of us can properly remember. And the more we try to piece it together, the more we realised maybe we weren't supposed to. Maybe the fact that we couldn't remember it correctly was the entire point. Maybe memory itself became the experiment, and we were all unknowing participants in something far larger than a single night in a small town could ever contain. What you're about to hear isn't a simple story of strange lights or unexplained sounds. This is about the nature of consciousness itself, about the protective barriers our minds construct when faced with information that shouldn't exist, and about what happens when an entire community shares an experience that none of them can actually share accurately. This is about the moment we all realize that memory isn't a recording device, it's a translation service. And sometimes, what it translates is designed to keep us sane, rather than keep us informed. Chapter 1. A small, shared town. I grew up in a place where everyone knew everyone. The kind of town where your business was everyone's business, where gossip travelled faster than wildfire, and where shared history was the glue holding the community together. We had 2 traffic lights, 1 grocery store, and a school that served kindergarten through 12th grade under one sagging roof. The population hovered around 800 people, give or take whoever had recently been born or moved away or passed on. The kind of number where you could genuinely know every single person by name if you tried. Nothing ever happened there. That was the point. That was what people loved about it. Safety, predictability, the same faces at the same places doing the same things year after year. When something did happen, a car accident, a store closing, someone moving away, it became the story everyone told, endlessly. The narrative was communal property. Details were negotiated, agreed upon, and locked into place through repetition. The Henderson's barn fire became legendary not because of the fire itself, but because of how the telling evolved. Initially, it was just a barn fire. Within weeks, it was a cautionary tale about proper electrical maintenance. By the end of the year, it had transformed into a story about community resilience, about how everyone came together, about the meals that appeared on their doorstep for months afterward. The facts remained stable, but the meaning grew richer with each retelling until the story belonged to everyone, not just the Hendersons. That's how memory worked in our town. Collective, stable, mutually reinforced. If someone misremembered a detail, 3 other people would correct them. Stories didn't drift because they were constantly being re-anchored through conversation. Memory was social glue, and accuracy was how the glue stayed strong. That's why what I'm about to tell you is so deeply strange. Because in a town where every story gets told 1,000 times until it crystallizes into truth, we had one story that never solidified, one event that everyone experienced but no one could define. And unlike other memories that fade or blur, this one stayed sharp. It just stayed sharp in completely different directions. The town itself was unremarkable. Located in the Midwest, far enough from anything significant that we never got caught up in larger events. We weren't on the way to anywhere. We were a destination only if you lived there or were visiting someone who did. The landscape was flat farmland punctuated by small clusters of trees. The sky dominated everything, stretching in all directions without mountains or buildings to interrupt it. On clear nights, you could see every star. The absence of light pollution made the heavens feel close, almost oppressive in their vastness. I didn't realize how strange this was until much later. As a kid, I accepted it. Memory was memory. Adults talked about things differently all the time. But when I came back for a reunion years later, when we all sat around trying to remember that night, I finally understood. We weren't remembering differently. We were remembering something that couldn't be remembered correctly. And the fact that we'd all lived in a place where collective memory was sacred made the fracturing of this one memory even more impossible to ignore. The town had a rhythm. Friday night football games in the fall, church on Sundays, the 4th of July parade that was more tractors than floats. The rhythm was comforting. It created structure. It created expectation. When something disrupted that rhythm, everyone noticed. Everyone talked about it. Everyone processed it together until it fit back into the pattern. except for that one night, that one event. It never fit back into the pattern. It existed outside the rhythm, outside the collective processing, outside the normal mechanism by which our community made sense of things. And somehow, without anyone deciding it should be this way, we all just accepted that. We moved on. We let the rhythm resume. We continued being the town where nothing happened and everyone knew everyone. But underneath that rhythm, underneath that return to normalcy, something had changed. Something fundamental. We all carried it. We all knew others carried it. We just couldn't talk about it because talking required agreement, and agreement was impossible. Chapter 2. The First Disagreement. The reunion happened at the old community centre, the same building where we'd had school dances and town meetings and holiday gatherings. 20 years had passed since graduation, and faces had changed, but voices were the same. So were the stories. We laughed about teachers, about pranks, about the small dramas that felt enormous at the time. Jennifer's failed attempt to dye her hair purple before prom. The time Michael accidentally set off the fire alarm during chemistry class. The blizzard that cancelled school for a week and left us all bored out of our minds. The stories flowed easily because they were well worn. We'd told them before. We'd agreed on them before. They were part of our shared mythology. The collective narrative of growing up together in a place where everyone knew your name and your business and your parents and your history. These stories were safe. These stories were home. Then Marcus brought it up. Remember when they evacuated the school that one night, he said, grinning like it was a funny memory. When we all had to go to the gym and wait? The table went quiet, not uncomfortable, just attentive. Everyone remembered. You could see it in their faces, the shift in expression, the slight change in posture, recognition. But not the comfortable recognition of our other shared stories. Something else, something that made the air feel heavier. That wasn't the school, Eleanor said slowly. It was the church. We all met at the church, Marcus frowned. No, definitely the school gym. I remember the bleachers. I remember sitting on those cold metal bleachers for what felt like hours. It was October, someone else added. Cold. We were all freezing. I remember my mum making me wear my heavy jacket and being annoyed about it. It was summer, I said, surprising myself, but I was sure. I remembered heat, humidity, the smell of cut grass, the way my shirt stuck to my back, the feeling of wanting to be anywhere else but trapped in a building during what should have been beautiful summer evening. You're all wrong, said Robert, who'd been our class president and always spoke with absolute certainty. It was spring, late April, early May. I remember because it was right before prom and everyone was stressed about missing practice. We had a whole thing about whether it would affect the dance schedule. We went around the table, 9 people, 9 completely different time frames. Some remembered winter, some remembered fall. I was locked into summer, and I could feel the thick air, could remember sweat on the back of my neck, could recall the specific quality of light that comes just before sunset on a long summer day. But so could they. They felt their versions just as strongly. Okay, but what actually happened? Elena asked. Why did they evacuate us? Silence. Not the silence of forgetting. The silence of multiple people trying to access the same information and finding completely different answers. There was a smell, someone said finally, like burning, but not normal burning, something chemical, something wrong. No, it was a sound, Marcus said firmly. A hum, really low, made your teeth vibrate. I remember putting my hands over my ears, but it didn't help because it wasn't really sound. It was more like a feeling that sounded. It was lights, I said, and I remembered. Lights through the windows, bright but not blinding. Moving but not in any recognizable pattern, not like car headlights or spotlights or anything mechanical. Organic movement, purposeful but not comprehensible. None of you are right, said Jennifer. It was silence, complete silence, like someone had hit mute on the entire world. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just this absence of sound that was louder than any noise could be. We stared at each other. "Are we talking about the same thing?" Elena asked. We all nodded. Absolutely, unquestionably. Same event, same night, same fear, same sense that something fundamental had shifted, but nothing else matched. Not one single detail aligned across our memories except this. Something happened. We were gathered somewhere, and afterward nothing was ever quite the same. "How long did it last?" Robert asked. More silence. More conflicting certainties. "Hours," someone said. "We were there until almost midnight." "Minutes," said another. "Maybe 20 minutes tops." "All night," I said. "We didn't leave until morning." The impossibilities were stacking up. We'd experienced the same event but retained completely incompatible versions. And unlike normal memory disagreements, where one person misremembers a detail and others correct them, we were all certain. No one felt confused or unsure. Each person's memory was vivid, detailed, complete. They just couldn't all be describing the same thing, except they were. We knew they were. That certainty existed beneath all the contradictions. "Maybe we should try to figure out what year it was," Elena suggested. "That would at least narrow things down." But it didn't. Because when we started comparing the years we remembered, they spanned a 5-year period. Some people placed it in middle school, others in high school. One person was convinced it happened when we were in elementary school. The mathematics didn't work. We'd all been in the same graduating class. We'd all moved through school together. There was no 5-year window where we were all students simultaneously experiencing the same event at different ages. Yet that's what our memories insisted had happened. "This is crazy," Marcus said, but he was smiling, still treating it as a curiosity rather than an impossibility. "It is crazy," Elena agreed, "but I know I'm right. I know what I remember." Everyone nodded, because everyone felt that way. Everyone was right. Everyone was certain, and everyone was describing something completely different. That night, after the reunion ended, and people headed back to hotels or childhood homes or wherever they were staying, I couldn't sleep. I kept running through my version of the memory. Summer evening, school building, bright lights through windows, the feeling of time stretching, adults speaking in hushed, urgent tones, being told everything was fine while knowing that nothing was fine, the lights moving in patterns that suggested intelligence but not human intelligence, and then nothing. The memory just stopped, like a film reel running out. One moment I was in that room watching those lights, and the next moment I was home in bed and it was morning and everything was normal again. But how did I get home? Who took me? What happened between watching the lights and waking up in bed? I didn't know. The information simply wasn't there, and I'd never questioned it before, never noticed the gap. The memory had felt complete until I tried to examine it closely. Now it felt like a painting with a section cut out, the frame intact, but a crucial piece missing. I pulled out my phone and texted the group we'd created. "Does anyone remember leaving? Like, actually leaving?" The responses came slowly, one by one, and they were all the same. No. No one remembered leaving. Everyone's memory ended the same way mine did. Mid-event, mid-experience, and then suddenly home, suddenly morning, suddenly over. The transition didn't exist. In a group of people with violently conflicting memories about nearly every detail, we all shared the same blank space. That should have been our first clue, but we didn't recognize it yet. We were still treating this as a curiosity, a strange quirk of collective memory. We didn't understand yet that we were starting to uncover something much larger than mismatched recollections. We were beginning to discover that memory itself had protected us from something we weren't supposed to fully remember. Chapter 3. The timeline doesn't line up. Over the next few days, we couldn't let it go. It became an obsession. We created a group chat, started comparing notes, tried to build a coherent timeline. It fell apart immediately. Those who remembered winter were certain it happened during a snowstorm. They described walking through snow to get to wherever we gathered. the cold biting their faces, the way their breath clouded in front of them. They remembered specific winter coats, boots, the sound of ice crunching underfoot. Jennifer remembered her mother scraping frost off the car windshield in the parking lot. Michael remembered slipping on ice and catching himself on a railing. These weren't vague impressions, they were specific tactile memories with clear sensory details. Those who remembered summer were equally certain. They talked about cicadas, about wearing shorts and t-shirts, about how the air felt heavy and wrong in a way that had nothing to do with normal summer humidity. One person remembered their mother making lemonade beforehand, remembered the condensation on the glass, remembered the taste of it turning slightly warm in the heat. Another remembered fireflies in the parking lot, remembered trying to catch one before being called inside, remembered the brief glow between their cupped hands. I personally remembered it being a Friday, because I'd been looking forward to the weekend. I had plans. There was a movie I wanted to see, friends I was supposed to meet up with. The event had interrupted those plans, and I remembered feeling frustrated about it before the fear set in. But someone else remembered it being a Tuesday because they'd missed their piano lesson. They remembered their piano teacher calling their house the next day, concerned about the absence, and their mother making some excuse. Another person was sure it was a Saturday because they'd been at a birthday party earlier that day. They remembered presents, cake, playing in someone's backyard, and then later being pulled away from that normal childhood experience into something that wasn't normal at all. We tried to anchor it to external events. What grade were we in? What year was it? But even that fractured. Some people placed it in middle school, around 7th or 8th grade. Others were certain it happened in elementary school, maybe 4th or 5th grade. I would have sworn we were in 8th grade because I remembered being worried about high school starting soon. Remembered that specific anxiety that comes at the end of middle school. But Elena was absolutely certain we were in 5th grade because she remembered her 5th grade teacher, remembered the classroom, remembered specific details about that year of her life surrounding the event. The mathematics didn't work. We'd all been in school together continuously. We'd all been in the same classes at the same times. There was no year where some of us were in 5th grade and others in 8th. Yet we each carried these incompatible certainties. Robert started a spreadsheet. He listed all our names and asked everyone to provide specific details: date, season, location, duration, sensory details, what grade we were in, what we were wearing, who we saw there, what we were told. The spreadsheet quickly became a map of contradictions. Not a single column aligned across all entries. Every data point had multiple incompatible versions. Maybe it happened more than once, someone suggested. But that didn't feel right either. We all remembered it as one singular event. One night. One moment of strangeness that marked a before and after in our lives. Whatever happened, it happened once. We just couldn't agree on when, or where, or how, or what. Eleanor pointed out something interesting. Look at the duration, she said. We had estimates ranging from 15 minutes to an entire night. How can something feel like hours to one person and minutes to another? Time dilation, someone suggested. Maybe some kind of psychological effect. But that didn't explain the seasonal differences. That didn't explain why some people had physical memories of snow and others had physical memories of heat. Psychological time dilation doesn't change the weather. It doesn't rewrite which clothes were weather appropriate. It doesn't explain why Jennifer's mother was scraping frost in one version, while another person's mother was serving cold lemonade in another. I started researching false memory, confabulation, the Mandela effect. I read about how memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive, how we don't replay memories like video recordings but rebuild them each time using bits of genuine experience mixed with assumptions and context. I read about how entire groups can develop false shared memories through suggestion and social reinforcement, but none of it fit. False memories are usually vague. They lack sensory detail. They feel uncertain when examined closely. Our memories weren't like that. They were sharp. They were specific. They included details that couldn't have been suggested because we hadn't discussed them before. and each person's certainty remained absolute even when confronted with contradictions. Marcus found something interesting in his parents' photo albums. His mother was an obsessive photographer, documenting everything. He found photos from what he believed was around the time of the event. Family pictures, school pictures, random snapshots of daily life. And there was a gap. A period of about a week where no photos existed. Before the gap, photos were dated in his mother's handwriting on the back. After the gap, dates resumed. But that week, nothing. No photos, no documentation. Oh, just empty pages where there should have been images. Maybe she just forgot to take pictures, someone suggested. My mother, Marcus laughed. She once took pictures of me doing homework because she thought I looked thoughtful. She didn't miss days, let alone weeks. Others checked their own family albums. Not everyone found gaps. Some people's parents weren't regular photographers. But those who did find family photos from that era found similar anomalies. Missing periods, unexplained gaps in otherwise comprehensive documentation, or photos that existed but were weird. Jennifer found a picture of herself that her father had taken. She was standing in the backyard, clearly reacting to something above the camera frame. Her face was tilted up, mouth slightly open, eyes wide. But not scared. That was the strange part. She looked amazed, curious, almost delighted. The kind of expression a child gets when seeing something wonderful and impossible, like a magic trick they can't figure out. I don't remember this being taken, Jennifer said. I don't remember that moment at all. The photo was dated. The date matched one of the windows we'd identified as a possible time for the event. But the season was wrong for Jennifer's memory. She remembered winter. The photo showed her in a light jacket, leaves on the trees in the background. Fall, maybe early spring, not winter. Maybe the date is wrong, she said. But her father was meticulous. He always dated photos. And the surrounding photos in the album were clearly sequential. A birthday party before, a holiday gathering after, all properly dated, all making chronological sense. Except for that one image. That one impossible moment where Jennifer was looking at something the camera didn't capture, wearing clothes that didn't match her memory of the event she knew the photo was somehow connected to. We started calling these witness photos, images that seemed to document reactions to something without documenting the something itself. Several people found them. Adults and children caught mid-reaction, looking at things outside the frame, their body language suggesting awareness of something significant. But never any indication of what. The dates on these photos didn't match each other. They spanned different months, different years. If they were all documenting the same event, that event had to have been happening at multiple points in time, which was impossible, unless the event itself existed outside normal time, unless it occupied multiple moments simultaneously, unless when people remember it happening at different times, they're all correct because it happened at all those times. But that was insane. That wasn't how reality worked. Events happened in sequence. They had a specific temporal location. You couldn't have a thing that occurred in winter and summer simultaneously. You couldn't have an experience that took place when you were 10 and when you were 13. Yet the evidence kept suggesting exactly that. And the evidence wasn't vague or uncertain. It was specific. It was documented. It was real. We were trying to solve a mystery using the assumption that reality followed rules we understood. But what if the mystery was that reality had briefly stopped following those rules? What if the reason our memories couldn't align wasn't because memory was broken, but because what we were trying to remember had been broken in a different way? Maybe we need to stop trying to figure out when it happened, Elena said during one of our marathon group chat sessions, and start trying to figure out what it means that we can't. That shifted everything. Because she was right. The confusion itself was data. The contradictions were information. We'd been treating our incompatible memories as a problem to solve, as a puzzle where eventually we'd find the right pieces and everything would click into place. But what if the fact that the pieces didn't fit was the answer? What if memory had fractured for a reason? What if each person's mind had constructed a survivable version of something that wasn't survivable in its true form? We stopped trying to build a consensus timeline. We started documenting the differences instead. We created a massive document listing every single variation, every contradiction, every impossible detail. It grew to dozens of pages, and as it grew, a pattern began to emerge. Each person's memory was consistent within itself. Internally, the logic held. If someone remembered winter, all their details supported winter. Clothing, weather, indoor temperature, everything. If someone remembered summer, their entire memory was coherent to summer. No one had a memory that was internally contradictory. It was only when we compared memories that reality fell apart. It was only in the gaps between minds that impossibility emerged. That meant something. We didn't know what yet, but it meant something significant. Our minds had each constructed a coherent version of an incoherent event, and the coherence itself was suspicious, almost like it was designed, almost like something had been translated into terms we could process, almost like something had been protecting us from the truth. Chapter 4. Physical evidence that contradicts memory. Eleanor worked at the library. She had access to the town archives, boxes of old photographs that local families had donated over the years. Historical preservation was her job. She knew the collection intimately. She started digging, looking for anything from the time frame we'd discussed, or rather, time frames. She found something. In a box labelled with a range of years that covered all our conflicting dates, there were photos from what appeared to be a school event. The images were casual, the kind parents take, slightly blurry with bad lighting and imperfect composition. But the subjects were wrong. People were looking up. Dozens of faces, children and adults, all tilted towards something above the camera's view. Their expressions were identical. Not scared exactly. Not even surprised. Something else. Something that looked like recognition mixed with confusion. Like seeing something familiar in an impossible context. Like watching your childhood home float 6 feet off the ground. Wrong. Impossible. But undeniably what you're seeing. And the shadows were wrong. Eleanor noticed it first. She'd been trained in photographic analysis as part of her library science degree. She knew how to identify time of day based on shadow length, how to spot manipulated images, how light behaved in various conditions. These photos violated fundamental rules. The photos were taken indoors. You could see the gymnasium walls in the background, the polished wood floor, the folded bleachers against the wall. But the shadows fell at sharp angles, as if there were a light source above and to the left, positioned maybe 10 feet off the ground, casting light downward at approximately a 45-degree angle. Except gymnasiums don't have lights positioned that way. The fluorescent panels were visible in some shots, standard ceiling-mounted rectangles running in parallel lines across the ceiling. But the shadows didn't match those lights. The shadows ignored the actual light sources and responded to something else entirely. Something else was illuminating the room, something positioned where nothing should have been, and whatever it was, it cast light that behaved like light, creating shadows, illuminating faces, reflecting off surfaces, but coming from a source that didn't exist. But the strangest detail, the photos showed nothing else unusual, no mysterious objects, no strange phenomena, no obvious cause for the reactions. Just people reacting to something the camera didn't capture, or couldn't capture. We passed the photos around during our next in-person meeting. Everyone recognized them immediately. "That's it," Marcus said. "That's the night." "That's definitely it," Jennifer agreed. "I can feel it. Like muscle memory, but for emotions. Looking at these makes me feel exactly how I felt that night." Others nodded. The recognition was visceral. But the strange thing was, people recognized photos that contradicted their memories. Marcus, who remembered winter, recognized photos where people were in light clothing. Jennifer, who remembered being at the church, recognized photos clearly taken in the school gymnasium. I, who remembered summer evening, recognized photos that appeared to have been taken at night, based on the darkness visible through the windows. We should have been more skeptical. We should have questioned whether these were really photos of the event. But we couldn't. The certainty was too strong. These images were connected to that night. We knew it the same way you know your own childhood home, even if you see it in an unfamiliar photograph from before you were born. Recognition beyond logic. Elena had done more than just find photos. She'd started cataloguing them by whose family had donated them and when they were allegedly taken. The dates written on the backs of the photos didn't match either. Some were marked with winter dates from different years, others with summer dates from different years, different handwriting, different ink colours, as if multiple people had tried to document the same event and each person marked it according to their own memory. More disturbingly, some photos had been marked and then remarked. You could see where one date had been written, then crossed out, then a different date written in the same handwriting. People had changed their minds, or changed their memories, or memories had changed on them. "Look at this one," Elena said, holding up a photo carefully. It showed a group of adults standing in what appeared to be the school parking lot. Night. Cars visible in the background. All the adults were looking in the same direction, off to the left of the frame. Their postures were tense, protective. Several had their arms outstretched as if shielding children who weren't visible in the frame. "That's my mother," Marcus said, pointing to a woman near the centre of the image. "And that's your father," he added, gesturing to another figure. "And that's Principal Thompson. And is that Mayor Hendricks?" We identified nearly every adult in the photo, but none of us remembered seeing the scene. None of us remembered being in the parking lot at night. Yet there they were, our parents, our teachers, authority figures we all recognised, clearly responding to something, clearly protecting us from something, forming a human barrier between something outside the frame and something inside the frame that we'd presumably been part of. "The date on this is from winter," Elena said. "But look at the clothing. Look at what they're wearing. Light jackets, no hats, no gloves, no visible breath in the air. Not winter clothing, not winter conditions." "Someone remembered it wrong when they dated the photo," Jennifer suggested. "Or the date is right and the season is wrong," Elena countered. "Or both are right, and the photo somehow shows an impossible combination. We couldn't resolve it. The evidence was there, clear, documented, real. But it contradicted itself in ways that shouldn't be possible. Robert, always the pragmatist, tried a different approach. Let's inventory what's consistent, what appears in all or most of the photos. We spread them out. Maybe 20 photos total, from different sources, allegedly from different times. We looked for commonalities. People looking up or away from the camera. That was universal. Strange shadows inconsistent with visible light sources. Present in about 75% of the images. No direct view of whatever people were reacting to. Universal. Not a single photo showed the object of everyone's attention. Time distortion markers. In several photos, clocks were visible on walls. In one gymnasium shot, the clock showed one time. In another gymnasium shot that appeared to be continuous with the first based on people's positions, the clock showed a time 3 hours later. Same people, same approximate positions, 3-hour jump. "Maybe they're not from the same night," someone suggested, but the clothing matched. The exact same people in the exact same outfits. And in a small town where everyone knew everyone, you couldn't mistake identity. That was definitely Principal Thompson. That was definitely the same yellow shirt on the same child in both photos. Same event, same sequence. Impossible time jump. We found another set of photos that showed the opposite. A sequence where people clearly moved and changed positions, where children who'd been sitting were now standing, where a woman who'd been facing one direction was now facing another. Normal progression, except all the clocks in the background showed the exact same time. 10, 15 minutes worth of activity happening in 0 elapsed time according to the clocks. "The clocks were broken," Marcus said. "They'd stopped working." "All of them?" Elena asked. "In multiple locations? All stopped at specific times that happened to create impossible timelines?" He didn't have an answer. The photos should have been evidence. They were evidence. But evidence of what? They proved something happened. They proved people reacted. They proved our memories, however fractured and contradictory, were rooted in genuine experience, but they also proved that whatever happened existed outside normal reality, outside normal time, outside normal physics. The shadows alone, if you accepted them as genuine and not the result of photographic error, meant that light had behaved in ways light doesn't behave. Illumination from nowhere, shadows cast by sources that didn't exist. What if the cameras captured something our eyes couldn't? Jennifer suggested. What if the weird shadows are actually something visible to the camera but not to human vision? Some wavelength we can't perceive? Then we'd see it in the photos, Elena said. Cameras that capture non-visible wavelengths still display them as visible colours. Infrared shows up as red. Ultraviolet shows up as blue or purple. We'd see something. Unless it's something cameras can't fully capture either, I said. What if both human eyes and cameras are limited in the same way? What if these shadows are the artifact of something that exists outside the spectrum that either can properly perceive, the shadow of something that can't be directly photographed? It sounded insane, but the evidence was insane. We were trying to apply normal logic to fundamentally abnormal data. The photos prove something else, Robert said quietly. He'd been studying them carefully, making notes. Look at the faces. Look at the expressions. Nobody looks terrified. Some look concerned. Some look confused. Some look curious, almost excited. But nobody looks like they're witnessing something horrific. Whatever we saw, whatever this was, it wasn't experienced as a threat in the moment. He was right. Now that he pointed it out, it was obvious. The body language was all wrong for danger. People weren't cowering. They weren't fleeing. They were observing, processing, trying to understand. The adults looked protective, yes, but not panicked. The children looked amazed more than afraid, which contradicted another thing we all remembered: the fear. Every single person, when asked to describe the emotional tone of the memory, said they'd felt afraid, deeply afraid. A fear that had nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with cosmic wrongness. A fear that came from witnessing something that shouldn't exist. But the photos showed faces that weren't afraid. So either our emotional memory was wrong, or the emotion came later, after the event, during the reconstruction, when our minds were processing what had happened and realized they needed to attach appropriate affect to an inappropriate experience. Fear wasn't what we felt. Fear was what we decided we must have felt, because anything else would have been more disturbing. These photos were breaking reality in subtle ways. Each individual image could maybe be explained. Bad lighting, broken clocks, coincidental expressions. But taken together, they formed a pattern of impossibility. Evidence that something had occurred outside the normal rules by which reality operated. And we'd all been there. We'd all witnessed it. We'd all survived it. Our memories were proof of survival. The fact that we could remember anything at all, even contradictory things, even impossible things, meant we'd endured an encounter with something that should have shattered consciousness entirely. The photos weren't answers. They were confirmation that we needed to keep looking. Because whatever happened that night, it left traces, physical traces, documentation, proof. And if it left proof that cameras could capture, maybe we could find proof in other places too. Other archives, other records, other attempts to document the undocumentable. Chapter 5. The Missing Sensory Detail. As we kept comparing memories, another pattern emerged. Elena noticed it first. She'd been creating a detailed breakdown of each person's account, looking for any kind of structure in the chaos, and she found one. Each person's memory was missing something. Not vague, completely absent. A sensory channel that should have contained information but didn't. And the missing element was different for everyone. Marcus remembered seeing lights and feeling vibration through his entire body, strong enough to make his bones ache. But he couldn't recall any sound. Not muffled sound, not distant sound. Complete auditory absence, even though he remembered people shouting, remembered being told to stay calm. He knew communication happened but couldn't remember hearing it. When pressed, he described understanding what people said without auditory experience, like reading words directly from their intentions. Technically, that's impossible, he said. I know people spoke, I know what they said, I just don't remember the sound of it, which should mean I didn't understand them, but I did understand them. Perfectly. Eleanor remembered sound, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once, bypassing her ears and resonating directly in her chest cavity. And she remembered the smell of ozone, sharp and electric, so strong it made her eyes water. But she had no visual memory of what caused it, just darkness punctuated by that sound and smell. When she tried to picture faces, the room, anything visual, her memory went blank. Not black, not empty, just blank, like that channel wasn't receiving data. I know where I was, she said. I can tell you the shape of the space, the number of people who stood near me, but I can't see any of it. I have spatial awareness without vision, which doesn't make sense because spatial awareness comes from vision, but somehow I mapped the entire space without visual input. I remembered light, intense moving light that seemed intelligent in its movements. I remembered the way it made everyone's faces look strange, highlighted from angles that shouldn't exist, casting shadows that defied geometry. But I couldn't remember any physical sensation, not temperature, not the feeling of the ground beneath my feet, not the texture of my clothing, not even my own heartbeat, just vision, pure and disconnected from physical embodiment. It's like I was a camera, I said. Just an eye recording information without a body to experience it through. Someone else, Michael, remembered only touch, the feeling of being pressed against other people, of hands grabbing his arms, of the floor vibrating beneath him in rhythmic pulses. He remembered texture and pressure and temperature variations in intricate detail, but no light, no sound, no smell, just physical sensation in a void of other input. Jennifer remembered smell primarily, not just the ozone Elena mentioned, but layers of sense that shifted and changed. Burning metal, fresh rain, something organic and alive, something ancient and mineral, a progression of smells that told a story she couldn't articulate. But her visual and auditory memories were fragmentary at best, and she had no memory of touch at all, despite knowing she'd been in a room full of people. I wasn't in my body, she said. That's what it felt like. I was just nose, just olfactory experience. Everything else was secondary or absent. As we catalogued these sensory gaps, the pattern became undeniable. Each person had experienced the event through a limited channel. But more than that, the missing sense was always the one that would have provided the most disturbing information. Marcus, who couldn't hear, would have heard something that couldn't exist. The sound would have been impossible, maybe not sound at all in the traditional sense, but vibrations in a frequency or pattern that human auditory processing couldn't categorize. His brain protected him by not storing auditory data. Eleanor, who couldn't see, would have seen something that shouldn't be possible, a visual that couldn't be reconciled with known reality. Her brain protected her by not storing visual data. I, who couldn't feel, would have felt something that would have broken my understanding of physical existence. Sensation that didn't map to a body. Experience without embodiment. My brain protected me by not storing proprioceptive data. It was as if each person's memory had filtered out the one detail that would have been impossible to reconcile. The one sense that would have contained information too alien to process. The one channel that would have transmitted truth that consciousness couldn't survive knowing. We're not remembering through one sense, Robert said slowly. We're remembering around one sense. Each of us has a hole where the impossible information would have been. But we all remember feeling afraid, someone pointed out. Fear is an emotion, not a sense. So where does that live? Fear might be the only genuine memory we have, Elena said. The only pure, unfiltered response. Because fear doesn't require understanding. You can be afraid without knowing why. Fear protects you by not needing explanation. That felt right. The fear was real because it didn't require the impossible information to justify itself. It was a reasonable response to unreasonable experience, It was what remained after everything else had been translated or filtered or removed. So what does this mean? Jennifer asked. That we all experienced something but none of us experienced it completely? That we're each carrying a partial truth? Maybe not partial, I said. Maybe complete but translated. Like our brains took in the full experience but could only store it by distributing it across different sensory channels for different people. Maybe the totality of what happened is preserved in our collective memory, but no single person has access to it all. So we'd need to combine our memories to know what actually happened, Marcus said. But we can't combine them, Elena countered. They're not compatible. They contradict each other on fundamental facts. We can't merge incompatible data. Unless the incompatibility is the point, Robert said. What if the experience was designed to be remembered incorrectly? What if the fractured, contradictory memories are the success state rather than the failure? That stopped us, because it reframed everything. We'd been treating our memory problems as bugs. But what if they were features? What if something had tested humanity's response to the impossible, and our response, fragmenting memory in ways that preserved function while filtering impossibility, was exactly what was being measured? That would mean it was deliberate, Jennifer said quietly. That would mean something engineered this situation. Something made it impossible to remember correctly. Or something knows how human memory works, I said, and structured an encounter that would necessarily be filtered this way. Not engineered to be misremembered, just structured in a way that misremembering was inevitable, because the alternative was non-function. The implications were staggering. It meant we'd all been exposed to something genuinely alien, something so far outside human sensory processing that accurate memory was impossible. And rather than breaking us, rather than destroying our ability to function, our brains had protected us by constructing survivable versions, different survivable versions, custom-tailored to each person's psychology, each brain finding its own way to process the unprocessable. We should try combining the memories anyway, Marcus suggested. Even if they don't fit together, maybe looking at all the pieces will show us something. We tried. We spent hours attempting to construct a unified narrative. If Marcus saw lights and felt vibration, and Elena heard sound and smelled ozone, and I saw light from different angles, and Michael felt specific physical sensations, could we build a complete picture? We couldn't. The pieces didn't just fail to fit, they actively contradicted each other. When Marcus's memory said everyone was in the gymnasium, Eleanor's said everyone was in the church. When I remembered summer evening, others remembered winter night. We couldn't even establish a consistent timeline, let alone a unified sensory experience. But we did learn something. We learned that the event had been overwhelming, full spectrum overwhelming. Every sense overloaded simultaneously with information that didn't fit normal patterns. Our brains had done triage, saving what they could, filtering what would have caused damage, distributing the preservation task differently for each person. We'd survived by not remembering correctly. And that incomplete memory, that fractured, contradictory, impossible memory, was evidence of something so alien that proper memory would have been more destructive than helpful. We were looking at collective trauma. Not trauma from danger, but trauma from encountering something so far outside our reality framework that consciousness itself had to rebuild around it. And the rebuilding process created these strange, incompatible versions, each person getting a custom memory designed to keep them functional. It's almost merciful, Jennifer said softly. Whatever did this to us, whatever showed itself to us, it knew we couldn't handle the truth, so it let us remember lies we could live with. Or our brains did that automatically, Elena said. Maybe this is just what human consciousness does when confronted with the genuinely alien. Maybe every civilization that encounters something beyond their understanding goes through this. Maybe memory itself is the protective barrier that lets intelligence survive contact with the unknowable. Both could be true, or neither. We didn't have enough information to know whether the filtering was imposed on us or generated by us. We only knew it had happened, and it had saved us. Whatever we'd seen, whatever had visited our small town on that impossible night, had been too much, too alien, too outside the boundaries of normal human experience, and we'd survived by forgetting it accurately. That wasn't failure. That was the most sophisticated defense mechanism consciousness possessed. And it had worked perfectly. Chapter 7. The local records. Robert worked for the county and had access to old municipal records. After our breakthrough about the sensory filtering, he became obsessed with finding official documentation, something that would ground the event in bureaucratic reality. If it happened, there would be records. Government loved records. Schools loved records. Something had to exist beyond our fractured memories and ambiguous photos. What he found was unsettling in its vagueness. There were references, multiple references across different departments and time frames, but never descriptions, just acknowledgement that something had occurred and needed to be addressed. School board meeting minutes from one of the disputed years contained a single line. Agenda Item 7, addressing parent concerns following the incident. Motion to continue current protocols. Passed unanimously. No details about what incident. No specification of what protocols. Just that calm, bureaucratic acknowledgement that something had happened and decisions had been made. The local newspaper had a small article buried in the community section. The headline read, "Town Gathers During Disruption." The article was 3 sentences long. It mentioned that residents had gathered at an undisclosed location due to an undisclosed situation that had been resolved by local authorities. That was all. No quotes from officials, no description of the disruption, no follow-up articles, just that brief, almost deliberately uninformative notice. "This is bizarre," Robert said. "Newspapers thrive on detail, even small-town newspapers. They'd normally interview people, get quotes from the mayor, explain what happened. This reads like they were actively avoiding information." Police logs showed increased calls during several of the timeframes we'd identified, but the nature of the calls was marked as resolved on scene, with no further documentation. Dozens of calls over several hours on different dates that matched different people's memories, all marked the same way, all terminated without explanation. "Resolved how?" Marcus asked when Robert showed us the logs. "Resolved by doing what? These are official records. They're supposed to document police activity." "Unless documenting it accurately was impossible," Elena suggested. "What do you write in a police report when the situation doesn't fit any existing category? When what you responded to can't be described in bureaucratic language?" Medical records from the local clinic showed a spike in anxiety-related visits following the various dates we'd identified. People reporting nightmares, stress, difficulty concentrating, a general sense that something was wrong without being able to specify what. But no one described what had triggered these symptoms. The medical notes just indicated following recent event without clarification. The clinic records were particularly interesting because they included a note from the primary physician at the time, now retired, expressing concern about the number of patients presenting with similar symptoms, but unable to articulate causation, recommending community support resources for stress management following undisclosed collective experience. Undisclosed collective experience. That phrase appeared multiple times in different documents. Always undisclosed. Always collective. Always experience rather than incident or event, as if the documentation couldn't quite commit to claiming something external had happened. School attendance records showed an anomaly that made no sense. For a period of 3 days across multiple potential dates in multiple years, attendance was marked but no daily activities were recorded. Classes happened, students were present, teachers were present, but there were no lesson plans filed, no assignments noted, no record of what actually occurred during those school days, just attendance marks indicating everyone was there. "How is that possible?" Jennifer asked. "Teachers have to file lesson plans. It's required. The school board audits them. You can't just have empty days in the official record." "Unless filing accurate lesson plans would have required describing what actually happened during those days," Robert said, "and that was impossible. So they filed attendance, proof people were at school, but nothing about what occurred while they were there. We found similar gaps in other institutional records. Church bulletins from around the various dates showed cancelled services or services with no notes about topic or attendance. The town council minutes showed meetings that occurred, but had no agenda items listed. The library circulation records showed dates where the building was open, according to the logs, but no books were checked out or returned. It was as if the entire town's institutional infrastructure had experienced the same filtering our individual memories had. Official records existed, proving time had passed and activities had occurred, but the content of those activities was mysteriously absent. "This isn't cover-up," Elena said, studying the document spread across her dining room table. "This is accommodation. The town didn't hide what happened. The town couldn't record what happened, so it recorded that something happened while leaving the something undefined." "But why?" Marcus asked. "Why wouldn't someone, a reporter, a teacher, a town official, just write down what they saw?" "Because they couldn't," I said, finally understanding. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The same mechanism that filtered our personal memories filtered the official record. When people tried to document it, they found themselves unable to articulate it. Not blocked by others, blocked by their own inability to translate the experience into documentary language. Robert found one more document that confirmed this. A memo from the school superintendent to staff, dated approximately 1 week after one of the possible event dates. The memo was remarkable for what it attempted to say without saying anything. "Dear staff, regarding the recent situation about which we cannot provide full detail, please note that all standard protocols remain in effect. Students should be monitored for signs of stress, but excessive discussion of the matter is discouraged, as it appears to exacerbate anxiety rather than relieve it. Parents have been notified that the situation was handled appropriately, and no further action is required. If you find yourself struggling to document recent activities in your records, please use general terminology and focus on student well-being rather than specific incident details. Thank you for your professionalism during this unusual time." The memo said everything by saying nothing. It acknowledged that something had happened. It acknowledged that documenting it was difficult. It acknowledged that discussing it was problematic. And it provided guidance for navigating an undefinable situation through bureaucratic vagueness. "Excessive discussion exacerbates anxiety," Elena read aloud. "That's interesting. That suggests they tried talking about it and found that talking made it worse." "Makes sense," Robert said. "If everyone's memory is different, trying to establish consensus would just create conflict and confusion. Better to acknowledge something happened and move on without forcing alignment." The official records told the same story our personal investigation had uncovered. Something impossible had occurred. The town had experienced it collectively, and the town had collectively failed to create a unified narrative because a unified narrative was impossible. The experience exceeded the capacity of both individual and institutional memory to process it accurately. What made it haunting was the calm acceptance in these documents. No panic, no demands for investigation, no calls for explanation, just quiet acknowledgement and peaceful continuation, as if the town had organically understood that some experiences exist beyond documentation, beyond consensus, beyond explanation. The records weren't evidence of forgetting. They were evidence of a community choosing to function despite not fully understanding what they'd functioned through. They were proof that humans can continue, can maintain social structures and institutions and normalcy, even after encountering something that should have shattered all of that. We'd survived not just individually but collectively, and the collective survival looked like bureaucratic vagueness, institutional gaps, and official documents that said as little as possible while confirming that something requiring documentation had definitely occurred. It was the most human response possible to the inhuman. We wrote it down without writing it down. We remembered by not quite remembering. We moved forward while carrying an impossible shared past. And life went on. School continued, church continued, town council met, library circulated books. The mechanisms of community kept functioning because humans are remarkably good at functioning, despite confusion, despite contradiction, despite cosmic uncertainty. The records proved we'd survived. And survival looked like incomplete documentation, vague references, and the quiet agreement that some things don't need to be fully explained to be acknowledged as real. Chapter 8. The Unspoken Agreement. The more we investigated, the clearer it became that the town had made a choice. Not a conscious one, not a coordinated one, but a choice nonetheless. After the event, whatever it was, people had simply moved on. There were no town meetings to discuss it, no parent groups demanding answers, no investigative committees or official inquiries. Life continued. People went to work, kids went to school. The rhythm of small-town existence resumed without interruption. We found this staggering. In a town where a broken stoplight would generate 3 weeks of heated debate at the coffee shop, where the decision to change the school mascot had caused a near schism in the community, where everyone had opinions about everyone else's business, how had something this significant been absorbed without discussion? Then Elena found something in her mother's journal. Elena's mother had been a meticulous diary keeper, documenting daily life in careful detail since before Elena was born. The journals filled an entire bookshelf in her parents' home. Decades of handwritten observations, thoughts, records of mundane and significant moments alike. Her mother recorded what she ate, what she wore, what the weather was like, what Elena did, what happened at work, what was discussed at church. Everything. The entries around the event were bizarre. The day before, normal entry, weather, meals, Elena's homework progress, a neighbour's new car, plans for the weekend, several paragraphs of detailed observation in her mother's neat handwriting. The day after, normal entry, weather, meals, Eleanor's mood, grocery shopping, a phone call with a friend. Again, detailed and comprehensive. The day of the event, blank, not missing. The page was there. The date was written at the top in the same careful hand, but the rest of the page was empty except for one line in the middle. We were all together. Everything is fine now. Eleanor called her mother and asked about it. "Oh, that was a strange time," her mother said vaguely. "I remember feeling like I should write something, but I couldn't quite. I tried to write about what happened, but every time I started, the words didn't feel right. They felt dishonest somehow. Not because they were lies, but because they were incomplete. Like writing anything specific would be worse than writing nothing at all." "But what did happen?" Eleanor pressed. Her mother paused for a long time. "Honey, I don't know how to answer that. I remember being there. I remember you being there. I remember other people. I remember feeling like something very important was occurring. But when I try to be more specific, it's like trying to describe a dream after you've woken up. You know you dreamed something significant, but the details won't stay in your mind long enough to communicate them." "But you wrote that everything was fine," Elena said. "Why did you write that specifically?" "Because it was true," her mother said simply. "Whatever happened, and something definitely happened, it ended with everyone safe. That felt important to record. The safety, the togetherness, those were the only true things I could put into words." That phrase, "we were all together, everything is fine now," appeared in multiple places once we started looking. Marcus found it in a letter his father had written to a relative. Jennifer found it in an old church bulletin as a closing blessing. Michael found it carved into a bench at the park, undated but in a style consistent with that time period. I found it in my own mother's handwriting on a calendar square for one of the disputed dates. The exact same phrase, different handwriting, different context, different sources, but the exact same words, as if that was the only thing that could be said because saying anything else would require saying too much. "It's like a mantra," Robert said, "or a spell, something you repeat to ward off the need for further explanation." We started asking around more carefully, talking to people who'd been adults during that time, trying to gauge what the community-wide response had been. We were careful not to lead them, not to suggest anything. We just asked generally about that period, about whether they remembered anything unusual. Most people deflected. "Oh, that was a long time ago," or "my memory of those years is pretty fuzzy," or "why are you asking about that?" The last question, delivered with a tone that suggested they knew exactly why we were asking, but preferred we didn't push. A few people were more forthcoming, but in strange ways. The former police chief, now well into his 80s, said, "Some things happen that don't fit into reports. That's just how it is. You learn in this job that reality is bigger than the paperwork. Good officers know when to document and when to just manage. We managed. Everyone was safe. That's what mattered." The retired school principal, whom we found living in a nursing home one town over, said, "You kids are stirring up something that settled a long time ago. That's your right, I suppose. You were there. You have questions. But let me tell you something. Not everything that happens needs to be explained. Sometimes the explanation would cause more harm than the mystery. We decided, well, not decided. It wasn't that organised. But we collectively understood that moving forward was healthier than looking back. And we were right. Look at you. You all grew up fine, successful, well-adjusted. That happened because we didn't dwell." "But what were we not supposed to dwell on?" Jennifer asked. The principal smiled sadly. "If I could answer that question clearly, honey, we would have dwelled on it. The fact that I can't answer it, the fact that nobody can, that's exactly why we didn't." The former mayor was the most direct. We found him at the hardware store he'd owned for 40 years. When we asked about the event, he actually laughed. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Every few years, someone from your generation asks about that night, and every time I try to explain it, and every time I fail. Not because I'm hiding anything, because there's nothing to hide. We all remember it happened. We all remember being there. We all remember it being important. But the specifics? They're smoke. You can see smoke. You know it's real. But if you try to grab it, you come away with nothing." "So the town just agreed not to talk about it?" Marcus asked. "No," the mayor said firmly. "The town tried to talk about it. In the days after, people tried. But every conversation went in circles. People would start describing what happened and quickly realize they were describing different things. And instead of creating understanding, the discussions created confusion and anxiety. People got upset. Relationships got strained. So gradually, organically, we stopped trying. We acknowledged that something happened. We confirmed everyone was safe. And we moved on." "That seems wrong," I said. "That seems like giving up on truth." "Maybe," the mayor said. "Or maybe it's recognizing that truth comes in different forms. The truth is something happened. The truth is we survived it. The truth is we remained a community afterward. Those truths are accessible. The truth about what exactly happened. That truth might not be accessible to human minds, and chasing an inaccessible truth at the cost of accessible ones, that's not wisdom. That's stubbornness." It started to make sense. The town hadn't covered anything up. The town had accommodated something impossible by creating a shared framework of acceptable non-discussion. Not silence, not secrecy, just mutual recognition that certain experiences exist beyond language, beyond consensus reality, and trying to force them into words would damage the careful translations our minds had constructed to protect us. It was a survival mechanism at the community level, matching the survival mechanisms at the individual level. Just as each person's brain had filtered the experience to prevent psychological damage, the community had filtered discussion of the experience to prevent social damage. Both were acts of protection. Both were forms of intelligence responding to a threat that was more subtle than physical danger. The threat was cognitive. The threat was the possibility that forcing consensus on an event that couldn't support consensus would fracture the community as surely as the event itself could have fractured individual minds. So the community adapted. It found a way to acknowledge without defining, to remember without agreeing, to carry forward without resolution. And it had worked. The town remained functional. Relationships remained intact. Institutions continued serving their purposes. Life went on with grace and normalcy despite, or perhaps because of, the shared acceptance of an inexplicable past. Maybe that's what makes us human, Eleanor said during one of our late-night discussions. The ability to function despite confusion. the ability to move forward carrying questions we can't answer. Most animals need certainty to survive. They need to understand threat, understand safety, understand cause and effect. But humans, we can tolerate cosmic uncertainty. We can shrug at the inexplicable and make lunch anyway. Or maybe that's what makes this town special, Jennifer countered. Maybe most communities would have torn themselves apart trying to force consensus. Maybe we got lucky. Maybe the specific combination of people and personalities and local culture allowed for this graceful accommodation. Or maybe this happens everywhere, I said. Maybe encounters with the inexplicable are more common than we think, and communities all over the world have these shared experiences that never get properly discussed or defined. Maybe humanity is constantly brushing against something beyond understanding, and we survive it through exactly this mechanism. Vague acknowledgement and social agreement not to push for clarity. We couldn't know. But the pattern was clear. Our town had faced something impossible and had survived by not forcing it to be possible, by not demanding it make sense, by not requiring everyone's experience to align. The unspoken agreement wasn't weakness. It was sophisticated collective intelligence. It was the social equivalent of our individual memory filtering, a protective mechanism that preserved function by distributing the burden of the impossible across the entire community in a way that no individual had to carry too much weight. We were all together. Everything is fine now. Those words weren't denial. They were acknowledgement of the only things that could be safely acknowledged. Togetherness, the shared experience, fineness, the survival. Everything else was unnecessary detail that would cause more problems than solutions. The town had been wise, and we, digging into it 20 years later, were beginning to understand that wisdom. We could excavate the mystery. We could document the contradictions. We could prove something happened. But maybe we couldn't, and shouldn't, try to force it into coherence. Maybe the healthy response was the one the town had already found. Acknowledge, accept, move forward. Some truths were meant to remain undefined, not because they weren't real, but because their reality exceeded the framework by which definition occurred. Chapter 9. The Realization. Late one night, alone in my hotel room, the full understanding hit me. I'd been lying awake for hours, thinking through everything we'd discovered, and suddenly all the pieces aligned. The event wasn't forgotten. It couldn't be forgotten. It was too significant, too impactful, too deeply carved into the collective memory of everyone who experienced it. But it also couldn't be remembered accurately, because human neurology wasn't equipped to process what actually happened. So our brains did something remarkable. They created individualized translations, custom-built memories that preserved the emotional truth, the significance, the impact, while replacing the incomprehensible details with comprehensible substitutes. Each person got the version they could survive, the version that wouldn't break their understanding of reality. We hadn't been manipulated. We hadn't been programmed or altered by some external force. This was our own neurology doing what it evolved to do, protect consciousness from information that would damage it. Our brains looked at something impossible and said, I can't store this as is, but I can store something equivalent. And they did. The conflicting timelines made perfect sense. If the event existed outside normal causality, existing in multiple moments simultaneously or in no moment specifically, each brain would anchor it to whenever made the most psychological sense for that individual. Someone stressed about upcoming exams might anchor it to the period right before prom. Someone who associated major events with winter might place it in cold weather. Someone whose strongest memories were of summer freedom might place it there. The brain used personal chronological landmarks to file something that had no proper chronological location. The conflicting locations made perfect sense. If the actual location was incomprehensible, or existed in some state that couldn't be mapped to normal geography, each brain would substitute the location that best represented gathering safety or authority in their personal symbolic lexicon. For some, that was the school. For others, the church. For others, somewhere else entirely. The brain used physical metaphors for something that might not have had a proper physical location. The missing senses made perfect sense. Each person's memory excluded the sensory input that would have been most damaging, the input that couldn't be translated into safe terms. Vision, hearing, smell, touch, taste. Whatever sense would have conveyed the most disturbing truth simply wasn't stored, not erased, not blocked, just never encoded in the first place, because encoding it would have required processing information that would damage the processor. And the physical evidence aligned with this. The photographs captured genuine reactions to something that cameras couldn't record. The shadows were wrong because the light source wasn't something that created normal photonic shadows. It was something else masquerading as light, or interacting with light in ways that created artifacts the camera could capture but couldn't properly represent. The official records were vague because the people writing them were translating an experience even as they documented it, unable to access the true memory, while simultaneously knowing something significant had occurred. We'd encountered something, all of us, something that existed beyond human perception, something so far outside our evolutionary framework for understanding reality that direct experience would have been destructive. And rather than destroying us, rather than driving us mad with impossible information, our brains had saved us. They'd created survivable versions of an unsurvivable experience. The encounter succeeded precisely because we couldn't remember it correctly. I got out of bed and opened my laptop, started typing everything I was thinking. The pieces were fitting together in a way that felt simultaneously terrifying and revelatory. What if this was common? What if contact with non-human intelligence happened regularly, but was necessarily filtered through exactly this mechanism? What if every UFO report, every encounter story, every abduction narrative was a translation of genuine contact that the experiencer's brain had processed into the most comprehensible form available? That would explain the contradictions in those reports, the varying details, the way people described similar experiences in wildly different terms, not because they were lying or confused, but because their brains were each solving the same problem: how to remember the unrememberable, using different solutions. It would explain why physical evidence was always ambiguous, not because the events weren't real, but because the events existed in a way that physical evidence couldn't properly capture. Cameras could photograph reactions, they could capture artifacts, strange shadows, unusual light, distorted backgrounds, but they couldn't capture the thing itself because the thing itself existed outside the spectrum of reality that cameras were designed to document. It would explain why governments couldn't provide clear answers even when they wanted to, not because of conspiracy, but because the institutional knowledge was as filtered and contradictory as individual memory. Officials who investigated these events encountered the same translation problem. They found evidence, they found witnesses, but they couldn't construct a unified narrative because unified narratives were impossible when the underlying reality exceeded the framework by which narratives were constructed. The whole phenomenon, global, across cultures, across centuries, might be humanity repeatedly encountering something beyond our perceptual capacity and repeatedly translating it into manageable forms. The forms varied because different cultures provided different translation frameworks, but the underlying experience might be identical. The aliens, the angels, the fairies, the gods, all different cultural translations of the same incomprehensible contact, and the encounters continued because they were successful. Because whatever was making contact, if something was deliberately making contact, had learned that humans could survive it, that we had built-in protective mechanisms, that we could experience the impossible and continue functioning afterward. We were being tested, not for our technology or our intelligence or our worthiness, for our cognitive resilience, for our ability to encounter the alien and maintain coherent consciousness despite not being able to accurately comprehend what we'd encountered and we'd passed. Not just my town, every person who'd ever reported an unexplainable experience and then continued living their life had passed. The test wasn't whether we could understand. The test was whether we could fail to understand without failing to function. I felt a strange peace settling over me. For weeks, we'd been treating our fractured memories as a problem, as something broken that needed fixing. But they weren't broken. They were working exactly as designed. And the design was brilliant. Human consciousness had evolved a fail-safe mechanism. When reality exceeded processing capacity, memory translated rather than recorded. It preserved function at the cost of accuracy. And that trade-off, that sacrificing of perfect knowledge for continued ability to operate, was sophisticated intelligence at work. We weren't blind or limited or damaged. We were protected. And the protection was so elegant, so seamless, that we didn't even notice it happening. We just woke up the next day with memories that made sense, even if they didn't make sense when compared to others' memories, and we moved on, and we survived. Whatever had visited our town that night had learned something about humanity, had observed our response to the impossible, and our response had been to translate it into the possible, even if that meant creating dozens of different possible versions that contradicted each other. That was remarkable. That was worth observing. That might even be what made humanity interesting to something far more advanced. Not our technology, which was primitive compared to beings that could manipulate reality itself. Not our culture, which was young compared to civilizations that might span millennia. But our cognitive adaptability, our ability to encounter the truly other and create functional understanding even when true understanding was impossible. I emailed the group my thoughts. The responses came slowly over the next hours as people woke up and checked their phones. Elena, this feels right. This feels like the answer we've been looking for. Not what happened, but why we can't agree on what happened. Marcus, so we're not crazy. We're protected. I can live with that. Jennifer, but do you think they knew? The aliens or whatever they were? Do you think they knew we'd remember it wrong? Robert, maybe they were counting on it. Maybe that's the whole point of first contact. Not to be remembered accurately, but to test whether we can survive not remembering accurately. And finally from Michael, does this mean it could happen again? If they learned we could handle it, could they come back? That was the question that kept me awake for the rest of the night. If our response had been observed and deemed successful, would the observers return? Would they test again? Or had they learned everything they needed to learn from that one encounter? Or maybe, and this thought was even more unsettling, maybe they'd never left. Maybe they were constantly present, constantly observing, and we simply couldn't perceive them except during moments when they deliberately made themselves available to human consciousness. And those moments were necessarily translated into comprehensible but inaccurate forms. Maybe we were always swimming in an ocean of reality we couldn't perceive, and occasionally something from that ocean touched us, and we felt it as something alien and impossible. And our brains did what they'd evolved to do. They protected us by translating the experience into something survivable. And that protection was why humanity continued. Why we could encounter the unknown repeatedly throughout history and not be destroyed by it. Why we could brush against cosmic truth and wake up the next day still functional, still ourselves, still capable of making lunch and going to work and loving our families. We were resilient in a way we didn't fully appreciate, and that resilience might be the most human thing about us. Chapter 10. Why it never happened again. The last piece of the puzzle was why. Why had this happened? Why to us? Why only once? We had no direct evidence, of course. No communication from the visitors. No message explaining their purpose. No follow-up contact. Just that one night, or multiple versions of one night, and then nothing. 2 decades of silence. 2 decades of normal life interrupted only by the questions we couldn't stop asking. But patterns emerged as we talked. As we compared notes not just on what we remembered, but on what happened afterward. On what changed. On what stayed the same. The event had observed something, measured something, tested something. Not our physical responses, There was no medical experiment, no physical examination, nothing invasive or harmful. Not our technology or our civilization. A small town in the Midwest had nothing unique to offer in that regard. Something deeper. It had tested how we reconstructed reality, how consciousness handled the impossible, how memory created continuity when direct experience couldn't. It had observed the mechanism by which intelligent beings protected themselves from information that exceeded their processing capacity. And it only needed to happen once because the data was complete. Every person produced a different translation. Every brain solved the problem of impossible memory in a unique way. The variations themselves were the result. The diversity of responses, the contradictory memories, the personalized filtering, that was the answer to whatever question was being asked. The experiment wasn't about what we saw or experienced. It was about how we remembered seeing and experiencing it. It was about the layer between raw input and stored memory, about the translation engine that made consciousness possible in a universe full of things consciousness couldn't directly process. That's why there were no follow-ups, no repeat events, no ongoing encounters. The phenomenon, whatever it was, had learned what it needed to learn. We demonstrated that human consciousness had a built-in protection mechanism against reality that exceeded our architecture. We'd shown that when confronted with the truly alien, the truly other, we didn't break, we translated. And translation, while imperfect, allowed function, allowed survival, allowed continuation. That might have been the valuable insight. That intelligence didn't require perfect perception. That consciousness could thrive even when surrounded by truth it couldn't directly access. That the filter itself, the mechanism that incorrectly stored impossible information as possible information, was a feature of intelligence rather than a bug. Marcus put it perfectly during one of our last conversations before everyone headed back to their regular lives. Maybe first contact already happened. Maybe it happens all the time. We just can't know it happened because knowing it correctly would destroy the knowing part of us. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it meant we might be constantly surrounded by realities we couldn't perceive, constantly interacting with forces we couldn't recognize, constantly being observed or tested or contacted in ways that left no trace we could consciously access. Comforting because it meant we were protected. Our consciousness had shields we didn't know we needed until something tested them, and those shields worked. We survived. We continued. We built lives and memories and meaning on top of an experience that shouldn't have been survivable. That wasn't failure of perception. That was triumph of consciousness. Whatever observed us that night got its answer. Humans can encounter the impossible and create possible versions. We can experience what we can't understand and still maintain coherent identity. We're protected by the very limitations that seem to constrain us. Our inability to perceive ultimate reality wasn't weakness. It was the sophisticated defense mechanism that allowed us to exist in a universe full of things that would otherwise overwhelm consciousness. The event never repeated because it succeeded perfectly the first time. One data point was sufficient. One small town full of people whose brains each solved the translation problem differently demonstrated the principle clearly. Further testing would have been redundant. Or maybe it repeated constantly, and we just didn't notice. Maybe our whole lives were full of encounters we translated into mundane experience. Maybe the truly alien wasn't rare. Maybe our perception of the alien as rare was itself a translation, a way of making constant contact with the impossible feel manageable by categorizing it as exceptional. We'd never know. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps being unable to know was exactly what made us worth contacting in the first place. I thought about what my town looked like from outside. A dot on a map. 800 people living unremarkable lives. Nothing special. Nothing that would attract attention. But maybe that was precisely why it was chosen. Because the response they were testing wasn't dependent on sophistication or advancement. It was fundamental to human consciousness. And a small town demonstrated it as clearly as a city or a nation, or the species as a whole would have. We were a sample, a data point, a test subject, and we'd performed beautifully without knowing we were performing at all. The visitors, if that's what they were, had probably moved on, probably testing other species, other forms of consciousness, building a map of how intelligence handled reality that exceeded its processing architecture. Our results were filed somewhere, in some form we couldn't imagine, serving some purpose we'd never understand, and that was fine. We didn't need to understand it. We just needed to have survived it, and we had. Epilogue. The encounter. We survived. I'm back home now, back in the city, far from that small town where I grew up. But I think about it constantly, about that night, about what we learned, about what we'll never know. Sometimes I wonder if they're disappointed in us, whatever they were. If they looked at humanity and saw a species trapped in neurological translation, forever separated from true reality by layers of protective interpretation. If they found us limited, insufficient, blind. But I don't think that's it. I think they found exactly what they were looking for. Evidence that consciousness can persist in the face of the truly alien. That intelligence can function even when true understanding is impossible. That we're adapted not just to our environment, but to the possibility of encountering things beyond our environment. Maybe that's what makes consciousness valuable in the universe. Not our ability to perceive truth, but our ability to survive falsehood when truth would be fatal. Not our capacity for perfect knowledge, but our capacity to function with imperfect knowledge. Not our understanding of reality, but our ability to operate despite not understanding reality. Maybe every intelligent species has this mechanism. Maybe it's the prerequisite for intelligence itself, the capacity to create workable fictions when reality becomes unworkable. Maybe consciousness arose precisely because it could filter and translate, because perfect perception of everything would paralyze rather than enable action. Or maybe we're unique. Maybe we're the species that can be shown the impossible and construct elaborate, individualized, protective lies about what we saw, and then live peacefully with those lies forever. Maybe that's our evolutionary gift. Maybe that's what makes humanity special in a cosmos full of intelligence. Not our wisdom or our technology or our culture, but our ability to be fundamentally wrong about something and still thrive. I'll never know what really happened that night. None of us will. Our brains made sure of that when they translated an impossible experience into dozens of possible ones. But I know something did happen. Something real. Something significant. Something that found us worthy of observation precisely because observation was impossible. The group chat is still active. We still compare notes sometimes, though less frequently now. The memories haven't converged. They never will. We've stopped trying to find consensus because we understand now that consensus was never the point. The variation was the point. The protection was the point. The survival was the point. Eleanor summed it up best last week when someone new joined the chat. Another person from town who'd heard about our investigation and wanted to share their memories. Maybe the most human thing we can do is remember together while remembering differently. Maybe that's what they wanted to see. That we can share an experience without sharing a memory, that we can have collective truth without identical truth. I think she's right. I think that's exactly what was tested, and I think we passed. We didn't forget what happened. We couldn't forget what happened. It was too significant, too impactful, too deeply carved into our consciousness to fade away like normal memories do. But we also couldn't remember what happened. We couldn't access the truth of it. Couldn't reconstruct the event as it actually occurred. So we did something more remarkable. We remembered what we were able to, and that was enough. That was sufficient. That was proof of something valuable. We encountered the alien. We survived the impossible. We protected each other through the act of remembering differently, because if we'd all remembered the same thing, that thing would have been something we couldn't live with. The diversity of our memories was the mechanism by which collective sanity was preserved. The encounter worked because we failed to accurately remember it. And in that failure, we demonstrated something success never could have shown. That consciousness isn't about perceiving reality. It's about surviving it. It's about taking in more information than you can process and finding a way to store it that allows you to wake up the next day still functional, still yourself, still capable of love and work and meaning. Whatever observed us that night learned that about humanity, and then they left us alone. Not because we failed, because we succeeded brilliantly at the one test that mattered. We proved we could encounter the other and remain ourselves. Even if remaining ourselves meant never knowing what the other really was, even if remaining ourselves meant accepting that reality was bigger than our ability to comprehend it, even if remaining ourselves meant living with questions we'd never answer and contradictions we'd never resolve, that's not a limitation. That's a superpower. And somewhere, in some way we'll never perceive, in some dimension or reality or consciousness we can't access. I think they know that now, because we showed them. One impossible night in a small town where everyone remembers what happened, just not the same way. And that difference saved us all, because if we'd all remembered the same impossible thing, that impossible thing would have broken us all the same way. But we each remembered a different possible thing, custom-tailored to our individual psychology, perfectly calibrated to allow survival. That's elegant, that's sophisticated. That's the kind of solution to an impossible problem that suggests consciousness itself is more remarkable than we give it credit for. We're not broken recorders, we're brilliant translators. We take reality as it comes, filter what would destroy us, and create functional understanding, even when perfect understanding is impossible, and we do it automatically, without training, without conscious effort. Our brains just do it. They protect us. They preserve us. They let us continue. The event in my hometown wasn't unique. I understand that now. It happens everywhere in different forms to different people. Every unexplained experience, every moment of impossible beauty or cosmic horror, every encounter with something beyond normal reality, they're all translated, filtered, rendered survivable. We live in a universe full of things we can't directly perceive, and we survive because we don't need to perceive them directly. We just need to perceive them sufficiently, and sufficient perception looks like translation, like interpretation, like customized versions of truth that preserve the important parts, the emotional truth, the experiential truth, the consequential truth, while replacing the incomprehensible parts with comprehensible metaphors. That's what memory is. That's what consciousness is. That's what being human is. We're not witnesses to reality. We're translators of reality. And the translation, while imperfect, is what allows us to exist in a cosmos that would otherwise be too much for beings of our particular architecture to handle. So I'm grateful for the event, even though I don't know what it really was. Grateful for my fractured memory, because it means I survived something that would have destroyed accurate memory. Grateful for the contradiction, because it means my brain cared more about my function than about my perfect recollection. And I'm grateful for my town, for the way we collectively handled something that could have torn us apart, for the wisdom of moving forward without forcing consensus, for the grace of acknowledging shared experience without demanding shared details. We were all together. Everything is fine now. Those words still resonate. They're still true. They're more true than any detailed description could ever be, because they capture what matters, the survival, the togetherness, the fineness of our continued existence despite cosmic disruption. Whatever happened that night, we survived it together, and survival together while remembering separately is perhaps the most profound form of connection consciousness can achieve. That's the story. That's the truth we can access. And it's enough. Maybe even more than enough. Maybe it's everything.